Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Begin with Story 1, the copper tunnels of Falun life and death in Sweden's Inferno. You are walking into the mouth of the earth. The year is 1367, and the Falun copper mine known as Stora Kopparberg looms with quiet menace in the province of Dalarna, Sweden. The morning is bitter, frostbitten, and unforgiving, but you don't feel it. The cold doesn't reach far down into the tunnels. Down there, in the deep dark veins of Falun, the problem isn't the cold, it's the heat, the stench, and the air that clings to your throat like damp ash. This was not a mine known for comfort. It was known for wealth, and that wealth demanded sacrifice. The landscape of the Inferno. From the outside, Falun resembled a festering wound in the earth. The terrain surrounding the great pit was barren, stripped clean by centuries of logging. The trees were taken not for fuel or homes, but for timbering the mine and, crucially, for the massive charcoal production needed in the smelting furnaces nearby. By the mid-1300s, the mine had already been in operation for hundreds of years. Rumors claimed it was opened by giants, or perhaps a fire demon who gifted copper to mankind in exchange for suffering. The red smoke rising from the smelters stained the snow, the air, even the people's clothes. In time, this eerie tint earned Falun the nickname, the Red Hell. Entering the earth. The miners, mostly men from surrounding villages, entered the mine through primitive shafts reinforced with rough-hewn logs. Some were lowered by rope. Others descended by narrow ladders slick with condensation and the grease of decades. There were no safety lights, no gas monitors, just a small iron hook, a tallow candle, and your senses. If the flame began to burn with a blue halo or flickered erratically, it was a silent warning, foul air. The miners called it bergsvett, or mountain sweat, a mixture of sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and other noxious gases. It wasn't the darkness that killed, it was the invisible. A day underground. You work 10 to 12 hours in shifts. Children as young as 10 are stationed at the upper levels fetching ore or hauling buckets, but deeper in the shafts, only grown men work. Miners are paid not by the hour but by the weight of usable ore they produce. This system rewards recklessness. Those who dig faster and deeper earn more, but they also die younger. The tools are primitive: a hammer, a wedge, and occasionally fire setting. Fire setting involves building a fire directly against the rock wall, letting it burn for hours, then quenching it with cold water. The sudden temperature change fractures the rock, making it easier to pry apart. But fire uses oxygen, and it releases smoke. When the air turns sour, you don't stop working, you simply tie a cloth over your mouth, if you're lucky enough to have one. Most do not. Ventilation shafts were few and inefficient, relying on wind direction and passive air currents. Ventilation by faith and fire. Some of the earliest systems of air movement in Falun were simple vertical shafts dug above the working face. In theory, warm air rising up would pull fresh air from the surface, but it didn't always work. Sometimes the air simply sat stagnant, humid, poisoned. So miners turned to another method: fires set in ventilation shafts. A burning fire at the top of a shaft would create a natural draft, sucking smoke and foul air upward and drawing fresh air down another shaft nearby. This method, while clever, often failed in damp weather or high winds. Still, it was better than nothing. The system was dangerous. If the fire was too large, it could ignite wooden supports. If it failed, entire tunnels filled with carbon monoxide, silently suffocating the workers below. There were no alerts, no signs, just silence. The smell of copper and death. Copper mining at Falun was not just a job, it was a sentence. The rock here was heavy with pyrite iron sulfide, which, when exposed to moisture and air, oxidized into sulfuric acid. This acid seeped into lungs, into skin, into bone. Miners frequently suffered from gruvstuka, literally, mine sickness. Their lungs burned. Their teeth fell out. Some developed ulcers that refused to heal. Others lost their vision in the dark, only to be blinded by sunlight when they emerged. And yet they returned, day after day. Society above the shaft. Above ground, Fallon's copper funded cathedrals, crowns, and coinage across Europe. The Hanseatic League depended on Fallon's copper for trade. Swedish kings treated the mine as a crown jewel. They taxed it heavily and monitored it through a company of burghers known as the Great Copper Mountain Board. But the miners saw little of this wealth. They were paid in rations and coin, but more often in scrip, a sort of promissory note redeemable only at the company's store. Many lived in debt. Others died before they could redeem what they had earned. The social structure around the mine was rigid. At the top were the owners and technocrats, often German engineers imported for their expertise. Then came the overseers. At the bottom, the miners and their families, living in soot-stained cottages and coughing through the nights. The corpse that didn't decay. One of Fallon's most haunting legends is also one of its most bizarre archaeological mysteries. In 1719, the body of a miner was found in a collapsed shaft, his corpse remarkably preserved by the acidic waters and minerals of the mine. His skin was leathery, his features intact. No one knew who he was, until an old woman, now nearly 80, stepped forward. She had been engaged to a young miner who vanished on the eve of their wedding decades earlier. She recognized the man instantly. He had been missing for over 40 years. His body had been mummified by the very poison that had killed him. He was given a full burial, but his corpse remained on display for many years, a reminder of the mine's silent power over life and time. As you return to the surface, your skin stings from copper dust. Your lungs feel heavy. You look out over the red horizon of Fallon, where smelters still belch smoke, and wonder not how many will die next, but how many will return tomorrow. What drives a man to descend, again and again, into the belly of a mountain that wants him dead? You return to the tunnels, not in body, but in memory, in the slow recollection of old systems, forgotten strategies, and the minds that tried to tame the subterranean beast of Fallon. For every miner who coughed blood into his hand, there was an overseer, an engineer, or a draftsman trying to keep him alive at least long enough to keep the copper flowing. In this section, we descend further, not just into the tunnels, but into the air itself, the very breath of the mine, because down here, air was not taken for granted. It was mined, manipulated, and fought for, as much as the copper itself. Breathing in a vacuum. Mining is not just about carving rock. It is about maintaining life where life should not exist. The deeper the shaft, the more pressing the problem of air became. The miners of Fallon, by the late Middle Ages, had descended hundreds of feet below the surface. The natural air pressure was lower, the humidity stifling, and above all, there was a problem that no surface dweller considered. The air didn't move. In a sealed space, the air becomes stale quickly. When multiple men are burning candles, using fire setting and breathing the same limited supply, oxygen plummets. Carbon dioxide levels climb, and that's not even accounting for the poisonous gases released from the ore itself, gruvgas, as it was called. Miners developed an instinct for detecting bad air long before science could measure it. A flickering candle, the faint scent of rotten eggs, a sudden dizziness, or a crushing headache, these were signals, warnings. And yet, what choice did they have? The mine needed to breathe, but how? Primitive ventilation, wind and wood. The earliest ventilation techniques were pitifully simple. Vertical shafts carved through the rock from the surface down into the working levels. In theory, the natural convection of warm air rising would draw in cooler air from lower entrances or horizontal adits. In practice, it only worked sometimes. On cold days, the temperature difference between inside and outside reversed the airflow. On windless days, there was no circulation at all. Some of the more advanced shafts included wooden ducts constructed from interlocked pine planks and sealed with pitch. These ducts could guide air deeper into the mine or redirect smoke out, but they degraded quickly in the damp, acidic environment. Rats chewed through them. Condensation made them rot. Overseers experimented with fabric flaps placed at key junctions, primitive airlocks to guide drafts through the tunnels. These methods helped, but only modestly. For most miners, the air they breathed was air they stolen from fire, from stone, from each other. The water problem. Ventilation was only part of the survival equation. Water invaded the mines with relentless consistency. Rain seeped from the surface. Groundwater percolated through rock fissures. The lower galleries of Fallon were often flooded. Water brought mold, corrosion, and a constant dampness that clung to lungs and tools alike. But more dangerously, it also trapped foul gases, particularly carbon dioxide, which is heavier than air. In low-lying tunnels, this gas would settle like an invisible lake. Step too far into it, and you would collapse, unconscious, before even realizing something was wrong. Some miners brought dogs or birds, a technique later popularized in coal mines with canaries. These animals were more sensitive to toxic gases and would react sometimes fatally before a man noticed. But even this was not a widespread practice in the 14th century. Many simply took the risk. To fight back, workers constructed pumps and drainage channels, often manually operated by teams of men or horses on the surface. This helped with the water but did nothing for the air. Still, the act of pumping water offered one side benefit: motion. The movement of mechanical systems created slight drafts, which some clever overseers learned to harness by connecting air ducts to areas of kinetic activity like hauling winches or bellows. It was clumsy, but it worked. Bellows and human power. By the early 1400s, mining at Fallon had grown more sophisticated, thanks in part to the influence of German engineers who brought techniques from the Erzgebirge, or mountains. They introduced man-powered bellows systems, similar to those used in blacksmithing. Large wooden bellows, some over 6 feet long, were stationed at the tops of vertical shafts. These could be operated by workers using long handles or treadmills. When squeezed rhythmically, the bellows forced fresh air down narrow ducts made of stitched leather or sealed wood. This air would displace stagnant air deeper in the mine, creating a rudimentary circulation system. Some systems even operated in pairs, one drawing air in, the other pushing it out. But these required constant manual effort, often by children or injured miners unfit for digging. Even with this innovation, the system was limited. Airflow was weak, the bellows tore easily, and the pressure couldn't reach the deepest tunnels. Yet the principle was revolutionary. Air, like copper, could be controlled by force. Fire-driven drafts. Perhaps the most dangerously ingenious method of ventilation came from controlled fires. By building a fire in a dedicated shaft, usually at the surface or upper levels, engineers discovered they could create an updraft, pulling smoke and bad air upward while drawing fresh air from lower entrances. This method, known as the fire draft chimney, became widespread by the 1500s but likely had earlier prototypes. The fire had to be carefully managed. Too small and the draft was weak. Too large and the risk of igniting timber supports or suffocating nearby workers increased. The fire had to be kept dry, protected from collapses, and constantly stoked. This method was surprisingly effective, and it worked even when wind or terrain made natural ventilation impossible. But it came at a cost. Fires consumed oxygen, charred the wood, and introduced soot into the air. In time, the miners began to accept it as a trade-off. Some air, even smoky, was better than none. Accidents and airless graves. Despite these efforts, asphyxiation remained a leading cause of death at Fallon. Entire teams were lost to silent gas buildups. rescue missions often turned into additional fatalities. One notable incident, recorded in the late 1400s, involved a group of 6 men working in a deeper chamber after fire setting. The fire had been extinguished several hours before, but the air had not cleared. When they returned, the candles of the first 2 men went out. They thought little of it. Within minutes, the men collapsed. The last 2 were found seated, apparently asleep but dead. Their lungs were pink with carbon monoxide poisoning. There were no memorials for these men, no grave markers. Their names were recorded in ledgers only to deduct pay. Death was part of the mine's balance sheet. The unseen engineers. For every innovation in Fallon's air systems, there was often an anonymous mind behind it: a carpenter who designed a new duct shape, a blacksmith who forged more durable bellow joints, a miner who noticed that deeper shafts cleared faster if a door was closed upstream. These were not scholars, most could not write, but they were problem solvers, survival-bred ingenuity. Occasionally, innovations were written down by traveling German mining engineers. Some of these would eventually influence the work of Georgius Agricola, whose De Re Metallica would become the Renaissance's definitive text on mining. But many techniques used at Fallon were never codified. They existed only in the muscle memories of men whose names we've lost. Even today, the exact layout of Fallon's medieval ventilation system remains partly unknown. The mine collapsed in 1687, leaving behind only partial diagrams and fragments of wooden ducts preserved in acidic soil. A breath of copper. You emerge again from memory, blinking in the dim torchlight of a shaft no longer in use. The wood is blackened. The walls are scorched. The air is still stifling, even centuries later. And yet, you can imagine the workers here. You can almost hear the wheeze of bellows, the sputter of a candle, the whisper of air dragged through a pipe of stitched leather. They were not scientists, not heroes, just people trying to breathe. But what happens when even breath becomes too costly to maintain, when innovation can no longer keep pace with depth? The mine is silent now. There are no more footsteps echoing through the tunnels, no more hammers striking pyrite-rich stone, no more bellows wheezing out gusts of stale air. But the silence is not new. Fallon had long been familiar with stillness pauses between collapses, moments after a death, hours when the air simply stopped moving. Now, in this final part of the story, we look at the climax and closure of Fallon's medieval chapter. We will walk through the collapse that changed the mine's fate, the attempts to resurrect it, and how the legacy of this dangerous place shaped science, survival, and memory far beyond Sweden. The mountain that swallowed itself. On June 25, 1687, the earth opened up. Without warning, a massive section of the mine collapsed inward, forming a gaping crater 300 feet wide and over 100 feet deep. The noise was heard for miles like thunder drawn from beneath the bedrock. Dust rose into the summer sky. Trees were uprooted. Entire sections of mining infrastructure vanished into the hole. And yet, by a miracle, or perhaps just fortunate timing, no one died. The collapse occurred during midsummer festivities, and the miners were above ground, drinking, celebrating, and dancing around the maypoles. This unexpected grace gave the event an air of divine intervention, and it became known simply as the Great Pit, Stora Sturt. It was not just a physical collapse, but a symbolic one, a final, dramatic exhalation from the mine that had spent centuries holding its breath. What caused the collapse? Centuries of underground fire setting, inadequate supports, and unchecked expansion had created a fragile honeycomb. Underground chambers were left empty to maximize copper extraction. When rainwater from the surface finally penetrated far enough, it weakened the last stone pillars holding everything in place. The mountain caved in on itself. Aftermath and the shift toward science. The collapse of Fallon's central section marked the end of an era, but it wasn't the end of mining. Quite the opposite. By the 18th century, Mining was no longer a blind man's gamble. The age of enlightenment was taking root, and science had begun its slow conquest of ignorance. Sweden, in particular, was fostering a new wave of practical thinkers, surveyors, chemists, and engineers who would study places like Falun as laboratories of geology and mechanics. In the years following the collapse, Swedish engineers began to meticulously map the remaining shafts, calculate airflows, and even experiment with mechanical ventilators powered by water wheels. The collapse had forced a pause, and in that pause, planning replaced panic. Among the scientists influenced by Falun was Carl Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy. He visited the site in the 1730s and was struck by the eerie desolation of the mine's depths and the sickly health of its workers. In his writings, he called Falun's tunnels the gateway to hell, yet he also documented the geology of the surrounding rock with clinical interest. Falun became more than a mine, it became a case study. The corpse again, a reflection on mortality. Let us return briefly to the most famous miner of Falun, the man whose corpse was found in 1719, preserved in the acidic, mineral-rich air of a collapsed shaft. This man, known only as the Falun Man, was not a king or noble. He had no records in the archives, and yet his body became an exhibit, a memento mori for an empire increasingly obsessed with science, anatomy, and mortality. For nearly a century, his preserved remains were displayed publicly, a silent sentinel of the mine's past. Visitors came not just from Sweden, but from across Europe to stare at the leathery figure, a man who vanished on his wedding day and reappeared 40 years later, unchanged. The mine had devoured him, yes, but it had also kept him. In time, he was buried with solemnity, but the story lived on. For many, he symbolized the mine's inescapable grip on human lives, the way it buried stories, secrets, and sacrifices until it chose to let them rise again. Closing the vein. As the centuries turned, Falun's copper declined in purity. The best ore had been extracted. New technologies made smaller mines more efficient. And Sweden, like many European nations, was shifting focus toward coal and iron. By the early 20th century, large-scale mining at Falun ceased. The tunnels were sealed or left to flood. Some shafts remained open for ventilation studies or tourism. Others were forgotten, becoming the hollowed scars of an age long past. But Falun never truly disappeared. Its red slag heaps, acid-stained rocks, and smelters became historical landmarks. In 2001, the Falun mine was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, not for its grandeur, but for its long-standing contribution to human survival, industry, and innovation. People had suffered here, starved, coughed, died. But they had also solved problems. They had forged systems out of necessity, ducts from desperation, bellows from hope. And in the end, the most poisonous place in Sweden had taught the world how to live longer underground. Legacy of the mine, lessons in breath and burn. The survival strategies developed at Falun, however crude, laid the foundation for modern mine ventilation. The idea that air must be mined alongside ore became a universal truth in all industrial extraction systems. Engineers across Europe learned from the collapses and compensations made in Falun. The fire chimney method, though risky, became a precursor to mechanical fans. The use of animal indicators like birds was refined into early gas detection methods. The recognition of toxic gas stratification informed modern air circulation design in enclosed spaces. Even NASA, centuries later, would study medieval mines like Falun when designing life support systems for confined space environments, acknowledging that the solutions of survival often begin in places where people have the least room to fail. Reflection: what lies beneath? You imagine standing at the edge of the great pit where the mine collapsed, now grown over with moss and memory. The air smells like rust and pine needles. It is quiet. But you know what lies beneath. centuries of ingenuity, error, breath, and bone. The story of Fallon is not dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no great battles, no heroic last stands, no speeches etched into history. There was only work, day after day, underground. And perhaps that is the most profound story of all the boring, painful, necessary history of people surviving in a place that tried, again and again, to kill them. It leaves us with one last question. If every breath we take today is made easier by those who once struggled just to breathe, what else do we owe to the forgotten engineers of our past? Story 2. Bohemia's silver veins, medieval air pumps, and the price of ingenuity. You are standing in the heart of Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic. But it's the year 1380, and the earth beneath your feet is laced with veins of silver. The town is called Kutná Hora, and its silver mines are the bloodstream of the Kingdom of Bohemia, a region that, for a time, held more financial power than the king's court itself. This is not a village of peasants and pitchforks. This is a place of vaults, tunnels, secret passages, and machines where the hum of wooden gears and the groaning of oxen-driven lifts mark the beat of daily life. But underneath all this prosperity is a simple, brutal truth. Without air, none of it could exist. A town built on ore. Kutná Hora's story begins, as many medieval mining towns do, with a serendipitous discovery. In the mid-13th century, monks from the nearby Sedlec Abbey found raw silver near a hillside spring. The news spread quickly. Within decades, what had once been a quiet pastoral region became a chaotic hub of mining, smelting, and finance. By 1300, the mines of Kutná Hora were producing up to 20 tons of silver per year, an astonishing output for the time. It became the economic engine of the Bohemian crown lands, attracting engineers from the German states, laborers from Poland and Hungary, and money lenders from Italy. Coins minted in Kutná Hora, the Prague groschen, became the dominant currency of Central Europe, and the royal mint was installed there to ensure the king's oversight of the silver trade. And yet, for all the splendor above ground, the reality below was a different matter entirely. A descent into silence. The shafts of Kutná Hora descended deeper than most medieval mines, some plunging over 500 meters, 1,600 feet, by the 14th century. At such depths, miners faced extreme challenges. Heat, as the rock naturally grew warmer. Water seeping in from every direction. And most importantly, stale, toxic air, trapped in the tunnels like a coiled snake. Descending into one of the mine shafts meant leaving the surface world entirely. Torches were snuffed from the lack of oxygen. The air burned with sulfurous fumes from pyritic ore, and the only sounds were the creak of winches, the dripping of water, and the echo of pickaxes carving stone in near-total darkness. This was where men lived half their lives, sometimes never seeing daylight for weeks at a time. Life underground, the structure of survival. Each mine was a living system, with a hierarchy of workers and mechanisms. Hewers, face miners, dug the rock by hand with chisels and hammers. Trammers hauled ore in wooden buckets or sleds. Water lifters operated the pumps and drainage systems. Wind men were responsible for keeping air moving, often by operating mechanical air pumps manually for hours at a time. These jobs were not interchangeable. Becoming a windman was seen as both a blessing and a curse. You didn't have to dig, but you were often blamed when the air grew sour or someone died from suffocation. And yet, the mines of Kutná Hora became experimental laboratories for early mechanical innovation, long before the age of steam. The birth of the air pump. By the 14th century, miners in Bohemia were using mechanized bellows systems to push air into the depths. These were large piston bellows, driven by animal-powered treadmills or capstans, placed at key junctions above or near the shafts. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Air was drawn in through an intake shaft. It was pushed downward through sealed wooden pipes, usually made from hollowed tree trunks. These pipes extended hundreds of feet, directing air to areas that would otherwise be uninhabitable. At the receiving end, canvas flaps were used to spread the airflow into working galleries. It wasn't perfect. The airflow was weak and inconsistent. The bellows tore. The pipes leaked. But for the first time in European mining, air was not just a hope, it was a system. These pumps had to run continuously, day and night. If they stopped for more than a few hours, miners would be forced to evacuate, or worse, wait until someone else went in to retrieve the dead. The price of innovation. Installing and maintaining these early air systems was extremely costly. Engineers had to be paid, materials procured, animals fed, and labor scheduled. But silver was more valuable than breath, and so the investment was made. However, the men working underground rarely saw the benefits. Many died of asphyxiation, black lung, or arsenic poisoning from the ore. Autopsies, when performed centuries later on preserved remains, revealed collapsed lung tissue, spinal deformities, and chemical burns in the trachea. The price of ingenuity, it seemed, was paid by those least able to afford it. And yet the system continued to evolve. Bellows became larger, ducts became longer. Some mines even experimented with counterweight systems, where the motion of ore being lifted would drive an attached fan or pump. By the late 14th century, Kutna Hora was not just a mine, it was a machine, a coordinated network of tunnels, shafts, pipes, and power. The royal interest. The Bohemian kings took a direct interest in the mine's operations, not out of compassion, but control. In 1300, King Wenceslaus II issued the Ius Regale Montanorum, a mining code that laid out the rights and responsibilities of mine owners, laborers, and engineers. Among its many provisions was a section on keeping the air clear and good, which mandated that ventilation be maintained, and that shafts not be sealed unless air movement was assured. It was one of the earliest legal acknowledgments in Europe that breathable air was a requirement of labor, not just a luxury. Still, enforcement was uneven. When mining output declined, ventilation budgets were the first to be cut. In many shafts, air pumps fell silent, and entire galleries were abandoned rather than maintained. Some mines became known as the tombs, shafts where multiple men had died in failed resuscitation efforts. These places were taboo, avoided even by experienced miners. Ghost tunnels and forgotten paths. Many of the deepest and most complex shafts were lost for centuries. Flooded, sealed, or simply buried under collapsed rock, these forgotten tunnels became the subject of local legends. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeologists began to map the full extent of Kutna Hora's medieval mine system. What they found was astonishing. Over 35 kilometers of interlaced tunnels, spanning multiple layers. Wooden air ducts, preserved in mineral deposits. Mechanical parts of ancient air pumps, still in position. The deeper sections showed clear signs of air system design: narrow, straight shafts for air movement, sealed bulkheads, and broken bellows arms frozen in time. Some historians now believe that Kutna Hora's engineers were a century ahead of their counterparts elsewhere in Europe, developing closed-loop air circulation methods and even rudimentary air valves made from leather and pitch. A breath before the fall. But every great machine slows down. By the early 15th century, the richest veins of silver were dwindling. The cost of pumping water and air became too high. Mines were shuttered. Tunnels collapsed. Then came war. During the Hussite Wars, operations were interrupted, and many of the town's technical experts fled or were conscripted. Though the mine would revive in the Renaissance, the era of medieval innovation at Kutna Hora was over. All that remained were the tunnels and the air systems that once made them livable. As you stand at the mouth of one of these ancient shafts, you can still feel the faint breeze drawn from the mountain by some lingering draft. It smells of stone, damp wood, and history. You can't help but ask yourself, how many lives were sustained, if only for a few hours longer, by a breath forced through a pipe carved from a hollow tree? You return once more to the maze beneath Kutna. The torches flicker on the damp stone walls, and the silver veins pulse in the faint light like living threads through bone. But now, your ears are not tuned to the pickaxe, nor your eyes to the glint of ore. Instead, you listen for the rhythm of something softer, the breath of the mine itself. This section continues our journey through the world of medieval mine ventilation and the forgotten figures who made survival possible, not with bravery or strength, but with levers, leather, and the persistent logic of trial and error. As the mines of Kutna deepened, so too did the minds of the people trying to keep them alive. Invention by necessity. By the mid-14th century, Kutna's mines had reached extreme depths for the era. With each new level dug below, the complexity of keeping miners alive increased exponentially. Every 10 meters deeper brought less oxygen, more heat, higher risk of trapped gases, increased air pressure differentials that resisted natural drafts. What had once been handled with simple ventilation shafts or animal skin bellows now required innovation on a scale unknown in most of Europe. Unlike surface workshops or smithies, underground systems couldn't rely on space or fire for airflow. The materials had to be small, durable, resistant to rot, and built using the limited technology of the time. This gave rise to a series of mechanical breakthroughs, many of which were never written down, passed instead through apprenticeship and oral tradition. The air machine, a forgotten prototype. In a record dated 1391, preserved in the archives of Sedlec Abbey, a document describes a wind engine installed in one of the deeper galleries of the Osel mine, one of Kutna's richest shafts. This engine was, by all accounts, a kind of reciprocating piston pump constructed from wooden cylinders, leather-lined pistons, weighted levers operated by a horse-drawn treadmill above ground, interlocking valves made of canvas treated with pine resin. The device functioned like a giant lung. As the pistons moved back and forth, they drew stale air from the deeper levels and forced fresh air through a parallel pipe network. It was not fast. The system took nearly 30 minutes to refresh the air in a single chamber, but it worked. This engine, though primitive, demonstrated a remarkable grasp of fluid dynamics, centuries before those principles would be formalized. It also hinted at something deeper, that the miners of Kutna weren't just laborers, they were engineers, solving problems with what little they had. Material innovation, leathers, woods, and pitch. One of the constant challenges in medieval air pump construction was the availability of materials. Metal was reserved for tools, nails, and weapons, so engineers turned to linden wood, which was soft and easy to carve into hollow ducts. Elm and oak, preferred for strength in moving parts. Boiled leather, used to create flexible seals around pistons. Wool, soaked in oil and stuffed between pipe joints to reduce leakage. Tree resin, pine pitch, which sealed wooden ducts against air and moisture. These materials were perishable. Every few months, parts had to be replaced or repaired, requiring a constant flow of labor and resources. The system was always failing, always in need of attention. Yet rather than viewing this as a weakness, medieval overseers in Kutna adapted their workflow to accept breakdowns as a natural part of ventilation. Shift rotations were often scheduled around bellows maintenance, and miners kept spare duct sections near work sites. This was not engineering in the modern sense, it was engineering through rhythm, a dance of wood and breath performed every day in the dark. Human power, the living engine. The majority of pumps were not powered by animals. That luxury was reserved for the wealthiest shafts. Instead, air systems in Kutna were often driven by human muscle, in the form of treadle wheels, rotating planks powered by foot movement, hand cranks, geared to large wooden fans placed at shaft mouths, pull cords, ropes that lifted weighted bellows in repeating cycles. Miners too weak or too injured to dig were often assigned to ventilation duty, spending entire shifts pulling air through the earth. Some pumps were operated by shifts of children, chosen for their small size and light weight. It was easier to rotate the treadle when the operator was under 40 kilograms. These children, some as young as 8, became the invisible lungs of the mine. They were rarely named in records. Most are forgotten. The chain of blame. When a ventilation system failed, the consequences were immediate and fatal. In 1404, a cave-in in the Vlašski Dul shaft resulted in the deaths of 17 miners. The collapse was not due to a structural failure, but to a sudden spike in gas levels that ignited during fire setting, a method still used to fracture or rich rock. The airflow had been disrupted for several hours prior, due to a worn valve in the primary pump. The records from the Royal Mining Court indicate that the windmen on duty were imprisoned and fined, despite their protests that the equipment had been overdue for repair. This was the brutal reality of medieval industrial work. When air became a commodity, its absence became a crime. But even through punishment and loss, the system improved. New regulations required twice-daily inspection of bellows. Engineers began experimenting with double-valve systems, increasing airflow reliability. Some shafts were even fitted with counterflow designs, where stale and fresh air traveled in opposite directions through parallel ducts. Mapping the invisible. With all this complexity came a need to understand space in new ways. Mine maps from the late 14th century begin to show more than just rock and ore. They depict airflow routes, ventilation shafts, and control flaps. Symbols were invented to represent working pumps, stagnant zones, and emergency exits. These maps weren't drawn by cartographers, but by practical engineers, often in charcoal on parchment. They were passed from hand to hand, annotated with smudges and fingerprints. Some show tiny inscriptions at junction points: "Bad air here," or "Keep door closed to push wind down." This early understanding of pressure differentials, that closing one duct could increase airflow elsewhere, was not taught in schools. It was discovered underground by men who had no choice but to learn. Whispers from the stone. Standing now in one of these mapped galleries, centuries later, the air is still. But if you close your eyes, you can imagine the soft hiss of breath moving through the ducts, the crank of a treadle wheel, the low hum of effort. You can almost hear the engineers talking quietly, measuring the length of a pipe, arguing about the size of a flap, nodding in the dark. They weren't famous, they weren't even recorded. But they kept people alive, breath by breath. And so you wonder, if a civilization can measure its greatness not in wealth or war, but in how it delivers air to the voiceless, how many civilizations have gone unrecognized simply because they kept their people breathing in the dark? The tunnels beneath Kutna Hora are emptier now. As the 15th century turns and the silver veins thin, the sound of industry softens into echoes. But the systems, the machines, the maps, the mindset remain. These deep underground experiments in air, pressure, and breath would leave a mark far beyond the bounds of medieval Bohemia. In this final section, we explore how the minds and minds of Kutna Hora shaped the later world of engineering and survival. From collapse to cultural memory, from forgotten inventors to legal legacies, we close the silver vein with a final breath, slow, heavy, and laced with the weight of unseen history. Silver no longer saved. By the early 1400s, the veins that had once fed Prague's economy began to dry. The richest ore bodies were depleted. Extraction costs rose. Each meter of new tunnel demanded more timber, more effort, and most critically, more air. The balance was tipping. Mines that once operated on the promise of deep wealth now became economic sinkholes, barely breaking even after maintenance and labor. Ventilation systems, once admired for their ingenuity, now became burdens expensive, fragile, labor-intensive. As shafts closed, many of these air systems were left behind, sealed into the tunnels they once served. Some collapsed. Others remained intact, quietly rotting in the wet dark, unnoticed for hundreds of years. Even as Kutna-Hora's productivity waned, its reputation endured. Other regions began adopting its practices. Engineers from Saxony visited and copied its air pump designs. Polish and Hungarian mines began building dual-shaft ventilation models based on Bohemian layouts. Italian mining manuals translated references to Kutna-Hora's pumping wheel systems. A mine that was no longer rich still had something worth exporting knowledge. The engineer's silence. Despite all the innovation, no individual is credited as the inventor of Kutna-Hora's air systems. No names of windmen survive in the royal charters. There are no treatises, no journals, no blueprints bearing signatures. This absence is telling. In the medieval world, practical engineering was not considered an intellectual pursuit. It was labor, useful but not noble. And so the minds who created early negative pressure systems, dual-flow air ducts, and canvas-sealed bellows were buried alongside the ore they helped extract. It wouldn't be until the 16th century that Georgius Agricola, the German scholar and physician, would begin recording mining practices in detail. In his De Re Metallica, 1556, he described air pumping systems, some of which almost certainly descended from Bohemian designs. He gave drawings, cross-sections, and Latin names. But even he did not know who invented them. A town's memory in stone. Above the tunnels, the town of Kutna-Hora was changing. As silver declined, architecture became its new legacy. Funded by earlier mining wealth, the town built monuments to its former glory. St. Barbara's Church, patron saint of miners, was begun in 1388. Its flying buttresses and vaulted ceilings are still among the most beautiful in Central Europe. The Italian court, once home to the royal mint, became a palace. The Sedlec ossuary, a nearby chapel, was decorated with human bones, some believed to be from miners lost in shaft collapses. None of these structures explicitly mention air systems, but every stone and fresco echoes the lives that made them possible, lives spent working beneath the surface, ensuring others could breathe. Some of the underground shafts were later opened as tourist attractions. Guides would explain the conditions, the techniques, the risks. Visitors often gasped when told that the air in deep tunnels still smelled faintly of resin and decay, a breath held across centuries. The legal aftershock. Surprisingly, one of Kutna-Hora's most enduring legacies was legal. The Ius Regale Montanorum, the mining code issued by Wenceslaus II in 1300, remained influential for hundreds of years. It formalized the idea that the maintenance of air was not just a practical issue, but a legal obligation of mine owners and operators. This principle spread across Europe and can be seen echoed centuries later in the German Burgrecht mining law systems, Austrian Habsburg mining regulations, even early British colliery law, which eventually required ventilation minimums in coal mines. It's remarkable to think that a decree issued in a silver town in the 1300s would help lay the foundation for workplace safety expectations still debated today. Engineering by absence. In many ways, the air systems of Kutna-Hora taught engineers a powerful lesson, not through what they did right, but through what failed. Systems that lacked redundancy failed during labor strikes or illness. Ducts made from improperly sealed would often let air leak, suffocating miners despite functioning bellows. The absence of backflow valves led to cross-contamination of bad air and fresh air routes. Mines that depended too heavily on a single energy source like horsepower collapsed when famine or war made animals scarce. These failures were not in vain. They became case studies. Later engineers began designing systems with dual ducts, pressure relief valves, and self-closing flaps, all grounded in the forgotten mistakes of Bohemian tunnels. It's the kind of progress that's easy to miss, because it's built on an invisible medium air. The breath that echoes. As you stand again in the hushed dark of an old shaft, perhaps one that once housed a piston bellows operated by tired hands, you notice how very little has changed. Even today, deep in modern mines, air must be moved artificially. Ducts still carry oxygen into places where none exists. Fans still draw out gases that want to linger and kill. Sensors now flash where candles once flickered, but the principle is the same. Life must be sustained by planning, repetition, and the work of hands you never see. The engineers of Kutna Hora did not give us monuments. They gave us systems. And the miracle of those systems is that they are still here functionally, conceptually, silently. They didn't want to be remembered. They just wanted to breathe. And so we ask, if the most important inventions are the ones that allow people to live quietly, anonymously, and long enough to return home, who do we thank for the air that never runs out? Story 3. The tin miners of Cornwall. Candlelight, poisoned air, and the lungs of empire. It is dusk on the coast of Cornwall in the far southwestern tip of medieval England. The wind carries the scent of brine and peat, but as you walk inland toward the craggy hills above St. Just or Redruth, the air changes. It thickens. It darkens. And soon the only light comes not from the sky, but from a tiny tallow candle mounted on your forehead, waxed to your hat or skullcap with a piece of cloth. You're about to enter a tin mine, sometime around the year 1450. And the candle is not for show, it's your only protection against a death you won't even feel coming. Tin in the bones of empire. Cornwall had been mined for tin since Bronze Age times, but by the mid-15th century, the region's importance was surging. Tin was one of the essential materials of European life. It was used to harden copper into bronze. It lined pewter plates and tankards. It coated iron to prevent rust long before galvanization. And it was taxed by monarchs who understood its value in coins, weapons, and tools. The stanary system, a unique legal and economic framework, granted tin miners special rights and protections. Miners had their own courts, their own privileges, and their own form of law. This gave them rare freedom but also exposed them to extraordinary risk. For the wealth of the mine came not from wealth itself, but from the airless, endless darkness below. The descent by ladder and rope. Cornish tin miners didn't have vertical elevators. Instead, they used costining ladders, narrow, uneven, and often slick with water or soot to descend into the mine, sometimes hundreds of feet underground. If the shaft was too steep, or if it reached an especially rich lode or horizontal seam, miners used ropes or pulleys, often lowering each other by hand. The mines were rarely straight. Tin seams were erratic, twisted by ancient geology. As a result, Cornish mines followed no formal grid. They were like burrowing worms, curving and splitting and rejoining in a chaotic anatomy. Airflow naturally was an afterthought. Tallow flame and the smell of death. Each miner carried a tallow candle, mounted directly on their cap or jacket. The flame illuminated about 2 feet in front of the face, just enough to see your tools, the rock, and the dust drifting through the air. But the candle also had a second, more crucial role. It served as an early warning system for gas. Tin mines in Cornwall were not as rich in methane as coal mines, but they had other dangers. carbon dioxide from decomposing minerals, or slow oxygen starvation. Hydrogen sulfide from stagnant water pools, especially near abandoned shafts. Occasional methane pockets, especially in deeper or older tunnels near coal seams. When the flame dimmed, flickered erratically, or took on a blue hue, the miner knew to stop. Sometimes they retreated. Often, they just held their breath and pushed forward, especially if the load looked rich. It was a slow negotiation with death, one candle at a time. Breathing with the mountain. Ventilation systems in Cornwall were often minimal, especially before the advent of mechanization. Some mines had rudimentary air shafts, vertical holes bored upward from the galleries to the surface. These shafts, while intended to allow natural convection, were unreliable. On still days, the air simply sat. In winter, warm air underground struggled to rise through cold surface layers, revering the flow. To compensate, miners used basic tools. Leather flaps nailed to timbers at junctions could redirect breezes. Wooden boards, known as air doors, forced air to travel deeper into specific tunnels. In some shafts, fires were set at the surface to create an upward draft, drawing bad air out and fresh air in. This fire ventilation method was both dangerous and inefficient, but it sometimes worked. Still, the most common form of ventilation in Cornish tin mines was time working in shifts that allowed the air to recover between sessions. Tunnels were sometimes sealed for days to let gases escape upward. The ghosts of bad air. Miners spoke of the black damp, a term describing low oxygen environments. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it. Sudden weakness, dizziness, a falling candle flame. The white damp, meanwhile, referred to carbon monoxide, which was especially insidious. Miners would begin to feel lightheaded, euphoric, even cheerful shortly before collapsing. These terms would become more formalized centuries later in the coalfields of Wales and northern England, but their roots lay in these tin tunnels, where men whispered about invisible ghosts in the air. When a miner collapsed, others would often risk their lives to drag him out. If they succeeded, he would be placed near the mine entrance to breathe clean air. If not, he'd be buried near the adit, often without ceremony. Some shafts were closed entirely after multiple gas deaths, labeled choked in the records. The children of the spoil. Above ground, children played near the spoil heaps, mountains of discarded rock and tailings. But many were also employed in the cobbing yards, where they broke ore into smaller pieces and washed tin from crushed stone. Though not in the tunnels, these children also faced danger from fine mineral dust, lead residue, and long-term lung damage. Some were sent into shallow, narrow galleries where adults could not fit, known as scrinings. Their air was often worse than the main shaft, stagnant, damp, unmapped. They didn't complain, they couldn't afford to. Cornish ingenuity, the beginnings of engineered air. By the late 15th century, Cornish miners began adapting elements of mechanical ventilation, influenced by both continental mining techniques and local ingenuity. Hand-cranked fans, called wind wheels, were installed near deep galleries to draw out air. Large canvas ducts, stitched from sailcloth and tarred to prevent leakage, were used to funnel fresh air downward. At some sites, bellows, the same used in iron forges, were repurposed for air movement, operated manually or by water wheel. These systems were crude but effective in certain conditions. They introduced the idea of controlling the mine's internal atmosphere, rather than simply reacting to it. Still, the systems failed frequently. Floods ruined canvas, bellows wore out, shafts collapsed, trapping air in unreachable galleries. As with so many medieval technologies, the answer wasn't perfection, it was endurance. Candlelit politics, the stanary courts. What made Cornwall unusual was not just its geology but its legal autonomy. The stanary courts, established under royal charter, allowed tin miners to govern themselves, outside the jurisdiction of normal English law. This meant they could strike or walk off shafts without interference. They were exempt from military service under certain conditions. They had their own elected officials, stanators, who advocated for working conditions and wage disputes. But this autonomy came at a cost. If ventilation systems failed, if the tunnels collapsed, if the air went bad, no external authority would intervene. Miners relied on each other, on their foremen, on their own engineering, and most importantly, on the knowledge passed from old to young where to dig, when to stop, and how to tell when the mountain was about to take its breath back. As your candle flickers in the wet darkness, you pause for a moment still, listening, not for sound but for absence, the absence of wind, of motion, of life. You ask yourself, if this flame dies, will anyone know where I was? Now you've gone deeper, not just into the mine, but into the world it supported. Cornwall's tin veins didn't just power forges, they helped shape empires. From coins minted in London to weapons forged for continental campaigns, Cornish tin reached across oceans and centuries. But it all depended on something so ephemeral, so invisible, that it was often forgotten until it vanished: air. In this section, we watch how Cornwall's miners turned their backs to the past and began moving towards something greater: mechanization, global demand, and the birth of industrial-scale mining. But no matter how far the empire stretched, the miner's breath was still held close to the rock. From regional to royal. By the late 15th century, Cornish tin was no longer just a regional resource. England's growing naval ambitions required bronze for cannons, and that bronze required tin. At the same time, European powers were expanding trade networks into the Atlantic and Mediterranean, and pewter became the dining metal of choice across merchant classes. The result: demand soared, and with it, deeper and more dangerous mining operations followed. The tin mines of Cornwall responded with innovation, not necessarily out of curiosity or progress, but out of survival. The air was running out, and the deeper they dug, the more they needed to think like engineers, not just diggers. The rise of the water wheel, ventilation by force. Cornwall is a wetland. Its hills run thick with rivulets, rainwater, and springs. For miners, this water was both curse and salvation. By the early 1500s, Cornish engineers began adapting the water that flooded their mines to power the very systems that made the mines livable. Enter the water wheel. Overshot water wheels, placed above adits and connected to rotating wooden shafts, were used to drive chain pumps that removed water but could also be rigged to power mechanical fans. Air pumps, resembling multi-bladed fans or bellows, were rotated by the turning water wheels. These devices helped move stale air out of lower galleries while pulling fresh air in through surface ducts. In a few ambitious mines, dual-shaft systems were installed, one for workers, another just for airflow, known as the wind adit. These were not factory machines. They were handcrafted wooden devices, sealed with tar, reinforced with iron, and endlessly repaired. They squeaked, groaned, and broke regularly, but they worked. For the first time, the air in Cornwall's mines was no longer passive. It was controlled. The first engine houses. The beginnings of Cornwall's famed engine houses, those stone silhouettes that still haunt the cliffs today, were modest. Long before steam, they were built to house water-powered systems that operated fans, hoists, and drainage systems. These early engine houses served as centers of ventilation, using rotary fans connected to underground ducts. Anchoring points for bellows systems, placed at shaft mouths and operated by gear systems. Workshops where parts could be built and repaired quickly, ensuring minimal downtime in air movement. As these houses grew more complex, so too did the network of air pathways underground. Miners began constructing galleries for the sole purpose of moving air, not to reach ore, but to preserve life. Some of these airways were made of dried turf and timber, others dug directly into the hillside. All of them were shaped by intuition and repeated failure. Mapping the breath. By the mid-16th century, mine captains, senior miners who directed shaft development, began creating ventilation maps. These weren't formal blueprints, but sketched overlays on shaft diagrams showing where air entered, where it exited, where it stagnated, where improvements were needed. Symbols appeared: arrows for flow, crosses for danger, shaded areas for gas presence. The maps were based on observation, but also on accumulated local wisdom. For example, it was known that gases pooled in areas lower than the main drift. Working near recent fire setting could cause oxygen collapse. Drafts could be improved by temporarily sealing alternate galleries. Some of these maps survive today in scattered manuscripts and estate records. They are remarkable not for their accuracy, but for what they represent: air as an object of study, a thing to be shaped, not simply endured. Collapses, airlocks, and recovery. Of course, not everything worked. For every fan that turned, one jammed. For every gallery mapped, one collapsed unexpectedly. When shafts caved in, air pathways were destroyed. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence for anyone working below who relied on air from above. In some cases, a cave-in in one part of the mine caused a backflow of noxious gases into otherwise safe tunnels. Miners responded by developing emergency airlocks of a sort. Heavy wooden doors could be shut quickly to seal a chamber. Canvas curtains, soaked in tar and rigged on pulleys, could be dropped to isolate sections. Some shafts had counterweighted trapdoors that could be released from below, forcing air to flow in a new direction during emergencies. These were primitive, fragile systems, but they showed an evolving awareness of air as a dynamic force, one that could be weaponized by accident or saved through planning. When air became political. As the crown grew more dependent on Cornish tin, Parliament began regulating output and, eventually, conditions. In the late 1500s, pressure grew for mines to reduce accidents and increase efficiency. Though no national safety regulations existed, local stannary parliaments began imposing ventilation standards. These included requiring 2 exits for all deeper shafts, mandating inspections of fan systems every week, fining captains who failed to clear black damp from sealed galleries. In time, some larger mines hired full-time air stewards, responsible solely for managing airflow across multiple levels. It was a recognition, long overdue, that without air, nothing else could be extracted. The learning curve of breath. Cornwall's mines did not evolve in a straight line. Breakthroughs were followed by disasters. Mines opened and closed. Fans spun for a season, then failed. But slowly, generation after generation, a culture of ventilation emerged. Miners spoke of wind not just as a weather term, but as a subsurface force. Phrases like, "She's gone windward," "the air's reversed," "too much draft makes the rock sweat," "fast airflow caused condensation," "the wind's foul down load," a warning to halt work. These sayings were passed along like prayers, not poetry, practical prophecy. Because no one wanted to die without breath, in a tunnel their great-grandfather once dug, with a candle dimming before their eyes. A mine as a lung. Imagine the entire mine as a lung. Air enters through one shaft, winds through galleries, fills chambers, brushes past faces, candles, flames, and exits through another shaft, expelled like an exhale. Now imagine this system, mapped and improved not by doctors or philosophers, but by men with mud on their boots, who had no word for fluid dynamics but knew it by feel. They were creating a biomechanical organ underground, one that could be disrupted by a broken flap or saved by a timely door closure. And all the while the empire above grew fatter on tin, ships sailed, cannons fired, coins rang. Because somewhere in Cornwall, a windwheel turned. And you ask yourself, how many empires have been built on the backs of people whose only achievement was surviving the next breath? The candle sputters. You're deep now, too deep to hear the wind in the trees, too far for daylight to reach even as a suggestion. Around you, the rock sweats. Your hand is on the timber frame of a tunnel so narrow, your shoulders graze the walls. Every sound echoes, pick, drip, breath. You are not alone. Behind you are generations. Ahead of you, the slow death of the mine. This is the final part of the story of Cornwall's tin miners, not the end of the mine itself, but of an age. The closing of a chapter where the simplest of things, air, was won through blood, bone, and borrowed time. The empire's lung begins to fail. By the early 17th century, Cornwall's mines were deeper, longer, and more complex than ever before. Tin prices fluctuated, but global demand remained high. Cornwall was exporting tin to the Low Countries, Spain, and even the New World. And yet the work became harder. Deeper shafts meant longer haulage routes, higher temperatures, more stagnant air, and increased risk of collapse. Even the new ventilation systems powered by water wheels or hand cranks began to falter under the scale of the operations. The air could no longer reach the deepest parts of the mine. The flame on the miner's cap, once a guide, was now a warning system that often came too late. Mine captains began abandoning lower levels, not because the ore was gone, but because it was unreachable without oxygen. For the first time, air not rock was the limiting factor in Cornwall's mining economy. Collapse as an inheritance. Mine collapses became more frequent. A single compromised timber, eaten through by damp, could bring down entire galleries. When a shaft collapsed, so too did its ventilation pathways. And when ventilation failed, so did the confidence of the miners. A famous collapse occurred in 1631 at the Dalcoath mine, later known as the Queen of Cornish Mines. A team of miners working a newly opened lode encountered a pocket of white damp, likely carbon monoxide trapped after weeks of fire setting in a nearby shaft. 3 men were killed. 2 more died during the attempted rescue. All were found with candle wax melted onto their faces, likely from the candles falling as they collapsed. The mine was closed for weeks, not to repair it but to let it breathe. This practice became common. Tunnels weren't just dug, they were rested, as though the earth itself needed time to recover. From bellows to steam. Just as the air ran out, something new emerged, the steam engine. By the late 1600s, experimental fire engines were being tested in Cornwall. Crude at first, these early devices used boiling water to drive pistons that powered drainage pumps. But within a few decades, miners realized the same engine could power ventilation systems. Piston-operated fans, driven by steam, replaced water wheel systems. Airflow rates increased. Deeper levels were reopened. The most famous of these was the Newcomen engine, introduced in the early 18th century. Though inefficient by later standards, it was a revolution underground. For the first time, air was being moved mechanically, reliably at scale. The lungs of the mine had become metallic. But this shift marked the end of the medieval world underground. The hand-carved ducts, the wind men with their treadle wheels, the tar-sealed flaps, they became obsolete. The new air didn't hiss or drift, it roared. The last of the old wind. Not all mines modernized. Smaller operations continued using manual and water-powered air systems into the 1700s and even early 1800s. In isolated valleys, miners still relied on vertical shafts with fires lit at the mouth, hand-pumped bellows made of ox hide, sailcloth air ducts patched with wool and pitch. These places became known as dead winds, mines out of time, slowly dying from lack of breath. Miners in these locations often developed superstitions. They whispered about the stillness before a collapse. They feared tunnels that stayed dry and quiet too long. Some refused to work in galleries where candles burned too cleanly, believing it was a trick before the air turned. Breath had always been a measure of safety, but now it became something else. A superstition, a myth, a memory. The legacy in stone and soil. When Cornwall's mining economy began to decline in the 19th century, many shafts were sealed. The surface engine houses, once roaring with fans and gears, were abandoned. Wooden flaps rotted. Canvas ducts dissolved into the ground. But some things remained. Ventilation maps, drawn in charcoal and ink, stored in ledgers now yellowed and cracked. Stone-lined shaft, built for airflow, not access. Engine houses, whose chimneys still stand like monuments to forgotten lungs. Today, you can walk these landscapes and see the remnants of a living system, a once-breathing earth. What they gave us. The tin miners of Cornwall didn't invent ventilation, but they refined it, adapted it, and relied on it more than most communities in medieval Europe. Their legacy includes the standardization of airflow mapping, the dual use of power systems ventilation fans driven by drainage engines, the recognition that air was infrastructure, not incidental. Their struggle to breathe became a case study in engineering limits, studied by later mining societies across Britain, Europe, and even America. Some of Cornwall's systems were replicated almost exactly in the early copper mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Others found their way into the gold tunnels of Victoria, Australia. The breath that powered Cornwall's mines crossed oceans. Final breath. You emerge from the tunnel one last time. The candle is gone. The gear wheels are still. The shaft mouth is boarded up, but the wind still whispers through its cracks. You look out over the Cornish moor green hills scarred with engine house ruins, and feel the weight of a people who carved air into the earth. They did not seek fame, they sought breath, and for a time they won it. And so you ask, in a world built on fire, rock, and empire, how often do we remember the hands that moved the wind? Story 4. Coal and Collapse, the Forgotten Fires beneath Newcastle. The year is 1530, and you're walking above a sleeping inferno. Beneath your feet, deep under the ground near the River Tyne, coal fires smolder, hidden from view. They've been burning for weeks, maybe months. No one is entirely sure when they started, but above, on the streets of Newcastle upon Tyne, the only signs are a few cracks in the cobblestones, a strange warmth in the cellar walls, and the occasional sickening smell of sulfur. You are in one of the oldest coal mining regions of England, and this is not a new problem. This is a place where fire comes from the ground, and air, the very thing needed to live, is the same thing that fuels the burn. The buried wealth of Newcastle. Coal had been extracted from the ground around Newcastle since at least the 1200s, when it was called sea coal, named for the black lumps that washed up on the shores of the North Sea. By the 14th century, the surrounding hills and shallow cliffs were honeycombed with bell pits and at its primitive shafts dug into the coal seams. Unlike tin or silver, coal didn't glitter. It coated everything: skin, lungs, tools with a fine black powder. But it burned hot and long, and as London's appetite for fuel grew, so did the importance of the Tyne coal fields. The mines grew deeper, and with that depth came air problems of a different kind. The rise of the fire damp. Coal mines are notorious for dangerous gases. Newcastle's early miners knew this intimately, even if they didn't have the names. Fire damp was methane, which accumulated in low ventilation areas and exploded when exposed to open flame. Black damp was a low-oxygen mixture that could asphyxiate miners silently. Choke damp, mostly carbon dioxide, formed after explosions or collapses, replacing the breathable air. These gases weren't always predictable. Sometimes a gallery would be safe one day and deadly the next. Flames would dance strangely. Men would collapse without warning. No alarms, no sensors, just silence. And sometimes, when the fire damp ignited, it kept burning. The self-igniting mine. The fires that haunted Newcastle's coalfields weren't always started by miners. Sometimes, coal seams would ignite naturally through oxidation, pressure, and time. These spontaneous combustion events might begin in waste piles, where coal fragments reacted with the air and built heat slowly. In other cases, the very act of ventilation meant to protect life-fed oxygen into a smoldering seam, allowing an accidental fire to grow. Once lit, the underground coal could burn for months or years, nearly impossible to extinguish. In 1530, just outside the village of Benwell, miners attempting to clear a collapsed gallery reopened a shaft that breathed smoke and flame. It was said that the fire had been burning for nearly 2 years, contained by rock and distance until someone breached it. Several miners were killed, the shaft was sealed, and the fire continued deep underground out of sight. Ventilation versus fire. The deeper the mines became, the more ventilation was needed, not just to supply air to the miners, but to remove the dangerous gases forming in the rock. But this created a brutal paradox. Better airflow protected the miners, but also fed potential underground fires. Miners learned to balance airflow carefully. Too little, and black damp would suffocate workers. Too much, and methane would become explosive, or dormant fires would reignite. Engineers responded with air doors, fume dams, and controlled ventilation paths, using wooden partitions to isolate sections of the mine. In many pits, young boys known as trappers were assigned to sit beside these doors in pitch darkness. Their job was to open or close the door only when carts passed, maintaining the pressure flow that kept bad air away from working faces. Some boys died where they sat, overcome by fumes. Others lived but were never quite right again, their lungs weakened by the job before their lives had even started. Collapse from within. Coal mining in the 1500s was still primitive. Shafts were timbered with rough logs, galleries dug without consistent support. Over time, this led to cave-ins, which in turn created pockets of dead air and disturbed methane seams. But sometimes, the heat of a coal fire weakened supports until the earth itself gave way. One such collapse occurred in 1545 in a colliery west of Newcastle. Workers noticed steam rising from the spoil heap and strange heat radiating from a sealed adit. Within days, part of the hillside gave way, revealing a glowing red chamber rock and coal smoldering beneath the surface. The collapse killed no one. It happened on a Sunday, when the mine was closed, but it destroyed months of work and forced the abandonment of 3 nearby shafts. Miners began pouring clay and water into the affected galleries, hoping to smother the flames. It was a temporary solution. The fire migrated to another seam. Signs and superstitions. Without scientific knowledge, miners relied on instinct and experience to stay alive. Ventilation was not just physical, it was spiritual. If a candle flickered, it might be gas or the mine warning them. If a mine was too quiet, it meant something was coming. Rats fleeing a shaft were considered an omen of fire or collapse. Some miners carried sprigs of rowan or iron amulets, believing they protected against fire spirits. Others muttered quiet prayers before descending, knowing that even good ventilation wasn't always enough. In Newcastle, some chapels even held blessing ceremonies for mine entrances, where clergy would walk the shaft mouth and sprinkle water, praying for the air to remain clear. These rites didn't stop the fires, but they gave shape to an invisible enemy. The cost of the breath. Coal-powered towns, forges, ships, and cities. But to those underground, coal was also the source of death. The tension between airflow and flame, between breath and burn, defined the work. As the mines grew deeper in the latter half of the 16th century, engineers experimented with brick-lined air shafts to better contain and direct flow, flame tests, where a candle was placed on a long pole and slowly lowered to test gas levels, trial fans powered by treadmills or animals, though these were rare and costly. Still, the most common system was passive ventilation, relying on the physics of rising heat and falling cold, a system that worked when it did, and failed catastrophically when it didn't. Even so, the work continued. The coal was too valuable, and many believed the danger was simply part of the job, something inherited, not solved. As you stand at the edge of a long-forgotten shaft, feeling the faint warmth of rock beneath your boots, you wonder, how many fires still burn in the deep, fed not by carelessness, but by the very air that miners once prayed would keep them alive. The air is warmer now. Below the surface of the Tyne Valley, somewhere between the 16th and early 17th centuries, the mines have grown, so have the dangers. Coal is being dug not only for firesides but for furnaces, glassworks, salt pans, and iron foundries. It feeds a growing empire and the merchant class. But to fuel that growth, men are digging deeper than ever before, and the cost is no longer measured only in coin. It is measured in airflow, flame, and fear. This section explores how Newcastle's coalfields moved from reaction to control, how early engineers and miners began tamming the underground fires, not extinguishing them entirely, but managing the air around them like a living, hostile force. The furnace underground. As production scaled, underground fires became more frequent. Unlike dramatic explosions caused by fire damp, methane, many of these fires did not erupt suddenly. They smoldered, slow and relentless, fed by airflow and time. Several fires were started by careless fire setting, a method still occasionally used to loosen rock. Spontaneous combustion of coal dust and oxygen in poorly sealed galleries. Unextinguished torches or dropped candles, left smoldering in spoil heaps. Once a fire took hold, it created an oven underground. Temperatures in surrounding rock could exceed 500 degrees C, 932 degrees F. Timber supports caught easily. Airflow increased the burn. Miners began describing these spaces as the hot veins. In some cases, galleries were intentionally collapsed to smother the fire. But in others, the miners adapted, redirecting the air, birth of early ventilation theory. By the mid-1500s, practical experimentation led to a fundamental realization: airflow could be shaped. Miners and overseers started designing systems that intentionally redirected air away from smoldering areas, using canvas flaps to block off vents, stone walls or brattices built within tunnels to split or direct currents, timber airlocks opening and closing like valves. These were not scientific, but instinctive systems honed by trial, loss, and memory. A mine captain might notice that closing one vent reduced the smoke in another chamber. A group of windmen might experiment with keeping doors shut longer to prevent a draft from reigniting a cooled seam. These strategies were not written down, they were spoken, passed on, and slowly codified through repetition. Some mines developed routine airwalks, where a designated worker moved through galleries checking flow by holding a feather or loose fabric, watching candle flicker, breathing deeply, then holding it, and waiting for dizziness. In this way, a form of early environmental sensing was born, all without tools, all without formal theory. Sealing the fire. When fires couldn't be contained, they were sealed. This process involved stone and clay walls built quickly across burning galleries, wet blankets or turf to plug cracks and prevent air seepage, filling tunnels with mud slurry, a labor-intensive method that involved damming and redirecting surface water. These fire-sealing operations were dangerous. The air was toxic. The work had to be done fast, and often miners volunteered knowing they might not return. Some shafts were simply abandoned. They were left to burn, to collapse inward, and eventually to cool over decades. But the knowledge from these failures fed into something new: prevention. Early plans for controlled airflow. By the early 1600s, some Newcastle collieries began employing permanent air structures, including twin shaft designs, where one shaft functioned solely as an air return; timber-framed regulators in main drifts, with adjustable panels to control volume; dedicated wind doors, sometimes manned, sometimes rigged with counterweights. These developments mark the beginning of purpose-built ventilation planning, not just reacting to gas or smoke, but actively designing airflow before mining began. One record from 1614 notes the construction of a vent pipe laid in two parts of the drift, with canvas made tight against the frame. This was, effectively, an early air duct, and one of the first written acknowledgments of an engineered airflow path in an English coal mine. It wasn't yet science, but it was getting close. Children, candles, and calculated risk. The job of managing air still fell to the smallest and poorest. Trapper boys, often aged 6-10, sat in silence beside heavy doors. Their job was to open the door when carts passed and close it immediately after maintaining airflow pressure. These boys worked 12-hour shifts in complete darkness, with only the brief flash of light when a cartman passed. Some developed permanent vision damage. Others simply faded into the record as initials on a roster. In a few documented cases, older trappers developed their own sense of air control using scraps of cloth, animal tails, or feathers to sense changes in airflow and warn of gas accumulation. They were not taught to do this. They just knew they had to. Air made visible. Perhaps the most remarkable shift in this period is how invisible things: gas, heat, flow were made tangible. By the mid-17th century, mine maps began to include arrows not for water, but for air. Candle tests were standardized. A blue flame at 3 feet meant methane. Emergency escape plans included routes designed for better air. And when fires burned underground, miners didn't just react, they monitored, measured, and managed the oxygen feeding the flame. One report from 1662 describes a shaft sickened by breath and suggests that air was turned about by boarding off the dead path. It wasn't physics yet, but it was engineering in action from the bottom up. The people who learned to listen. What emerges from this period isn't just a story of tools or structures. It's a story of people learning to listen to their environment in a way most never had to. Listening to the air, feeling its warmth or weight, sensing where fire hid. This intuition became tradition. Tradition became method, and method laid the groundwork for the first industrial ventilation systems in the coming century. Now, standing near the sealed mouth of a long-forgotten shaft, you feel a faint warmth in the ground just like they once did. And you wonder, how many miners survived? Not because of invention, but because someone before them remembered which way the air used to blow. The tunnel is cold now. The fire that once smoldered deep beneath the streets of Newcastle has gone silent, or so it seems. But in the dark places beneath the city, air still shifts, stones still settle, and the ghost of every lost breath still lingers. This final section closes the story of Newcastle's buried infernos not with a dramatic eruption, but with the slow, grinding resolution of centuries of trial, endurance, and breathwork. We'll look at what followed the age of burning seams, what remains of those days, and how a mining community tried to understand an element as intangible as air long before science gave it a name. Smoke in the archives. By the late 1600s, Newcastle's coal mines had expanded significantly, and records grew more detailed. Colliery logs, legal disputes, and tax reports began mentioning things that had long gone unsaid. Ventilation loss, windward drifts, return shaft damage, air chocked. What had once been handled with gestures, warnings, and silence was now being documented. For the first time, the air underground had language. One report from 1687 describes a shaft breathing black and hot following a collapse. Another recommends a smothering of the hot vein with sod and woolen. A third details the use of a revering shutter, which, when closed, would push flow backward and clear a chamber. These were not blueprints. They were working knowledge, pressed into words by men who were no longer content to leave their breath unspoken. The long burn. Some fires never truly ended. In 1701, a survey of abandoned shafts in the Heaton area just outside Newcastle found one mine still giving smoke after 27 years shut. The stone was warm. The brattice walls had long collapsed. No miners remained. Yet somewhere in the rock, a slow chemical reaction continued. These eternal fires became legends. Children were warned to avoid certain hillsides. Carts were rerouted. In one case, a shaft was sealed with lead sheeting and covered with water barrels not to extinguish the fire, but to keep it contained. No miner expected these flames to be truly defeated. The goal was not conquest. It was containment. The first air laws. By the early 18th century, Newcastle's role as a coal exporter made it a strategic national asset. Parliament grew interested. So did scholars and engineers. In 1705, a mining act passed by local ordinance required all coal shafts over a certain depth to maintain at least two separate air paths, one for intake, one for return. This was the first codified air regulation in English mining. Though rudimentary, this rule acknowledged something miners had known for centuries. Without airflow, no shaft was safe. Larger collieries began hearing firemen, whose role was not to fight fire, but to manage and inspect air. These men walked the galleries before the start of each shift, testing with a flame, listening for strange echoes, tapping rock walls for hollowness. Their reports were brief, usually just safe, foul, or vent needed, but their role was vital. They were the first formal safety inspectors, shaped not by law but by generations of underground disaster. The dawn of scientific air. At the edge of the Enlightenment, air was finally being studied scientifically. Men like Robert Boyle, Joseph Black, and Joseph Priestley were beginning to experiment with gases, combustion, and pressure. But in the coal mines of Newcastle, these concepts had already been lived for centuries. They knew that stale air suffocated, that some gases exploded. That movement mattered more than purity. And that oxygen, though unnamed, was the key to life. By the mid-1700s, mechanical ventilators powered by steam or water were introduced. One such design by John Buddle, a Northumberland mining engineer, used a furnace at the base of a return shaft to create a continuous updraft, a safer refinement of the old fire-on-the-hill method. The science was catching up, but the principles they were already in place. The miner's memory. Perhaps what's most enduring from this era isn't a machine or a law, but a culture of memory. Miners passed down knowledge not through schools, but through storytelling at shaft mouths, warnings carved in timbers, rituals before descent, songs that named the dead and taught the living. One fragment from a miner's folk song, around 1720 goes, "If wind go still and wall be hot, lay down thy lamp and lose thy lot. For death is dry and black and wide, and fire walks where fear did bide. It's not a hymn, it's a manual, the breath that outlived the flame." Today, if you walk the back streets of Newcastle, many of the old mine entrances are buried under shopping centers, motorways, or parks. Some shafts have collapsed entirely. Others are sealed beneath concrete, monitored by sensors that now do what the trapper boys once did by ear and instinct. But some things remain. A slope in the ground, slightly warm after rain. Cracks in old stone where smoke once seeped. Bones of timbers that still smell faintly of ash. And beneath it all, the memory of air that mattered. Not the clean air above ground, but the kind that had to be chased, trapped, redirected, fought for. That air sustained families, powered empires, and took more lives than any fire ever did. As you leave the site of an old sealed shaft, your feet crunching over damp grass, you feel the ground exhale a breath you can't hear, but somehow still feel. And you ask, if the fire is gone, but the wind still moves underground, is the mine ever truly dead? Story 5. Salt and Suffocation Life below Wieliczka's Salt Cathedral. You descend into the ground, but this time, the walls glitter. Not with gold or silver or even coal, but with salt. Thick layers of mineral wealth, streaked white and gray, line the passageways. You are entering the Wieliczka salt mine, near Krakow, Poland, in the late 13th century, when the mine was already an established royal enterprise. It will remain in continuous operation for over 700 years. This is no narrow shaft or flickering tunnel. This is a world underground, a sprawling salt cathedral with chambers the size of village squares, chapels carved by hand, and wooden stairways slick with brine. But no matter how majestic the carvings, how fine the halite veins, or how divine the underground altars, there was still the same problem every other mine faced. Air. The deep value of salt. Salt in medieval Europe was not seasoning. It was preservation, payment, and power. Salt kept meat from rotting, fish from spoiling, and bodies from wasting. Kings taxed it, bishops blessed it, and entire trade networks were built around it. Wieliczka, located along ancient east-west trade routes, became one of Europe's largest and most prized salt sources, particularly after the discovery of rock salt deep underground. Early operations involved boiling brine from surface wells, but as methods improved and demand exploded, miners began digging into the salt deposits themselves, carving through layers of the earth like a sculptor shaping marble. By 1290, the mine was so valuable it was placed under royal protection, and soon after, engineers and laborers from across Central Europe were brought in to develop new systems for extraction, lifting, hauling, and critically ventilation. Because the deeper they went, the thicker the air became. The salt lung. Unlike coal or tin, salt didn't release flammable gas. The danger in Wieliczka wasn't fire, it was stillness. The mine sat in a naturally humid region, and the deeper chambers were prone to condensation, mildew, and rot. Water carried dissolved salt through wooden supports and into crevices, slowly crystallizing and expanding. The air, when left to stagnate, became stiflingly damp. Miners called it suffocating salt fog, not because of visible mist, but because of the way the air felt, heavy, warm, and slow to move. Their only defense in the early years was breath control, working slowly, taking turns in deeper galleries, limiting the time spent in the worst chambers. But as the mine expanded, so did the need for a system, a way to breathe underground. Shafts, stairs, and primitive airflow. The early mine consisted of horizontal galleries, stacked over time like layers in a book. Each level connected to the next through shafts and staircases, cut directly into salt or reinforced with pine timbers soaked in brine. These vertical connections served two purposes: to transport workers and salt, to allow passive ventilation, where warm air from torches and human bodies would rise and, hopefully, pull cooler air from surface vents or open adits. In winter, the system worked fairly well. Cold surface air sank naturally, displacing the warmer, stale air from inside. In summer, it failed completely. Heat and humidity trapped the mine in a suffocating inversion. Workers in the lower galleries reported headaches, nausea, and dizziness. It became routine to assign a young apprentice to sit near a shaft with a candle. If the flame began to dim or flicker, everyone was to evacuate. This role came with no extra pay, only the vague instruction to listen to the mine. Timber and salt, a dangerous relationship. Salt is corrosive to most organic materials. Wood warped, nails rusted, ropes frayed. This made constructing reliable air-moving systems extremely difficult. Still, attempts were made. Canvas-covered ducts, stretched from one level to another, were tested to channel airflow into deeper parts of the mine. These often collapsed under condensation. Wooden bellows, adapted from forge designs, were used at major shafts. Operated by hand or by counterweights, they helped push stale air upward or pull fresh air down. Cloth flaps, soaked in resin and nailed across tunnel junctions, acted as crude air doors guiding wind along predetermined paths. These systems had to be replaced constantly. Salt dust and dripping brine made short work of anything not stone. Still, they worked, and so they were rebuilt again and again. Carving chapels, creating drafts. One of the unique features of the Wieliczka mine is its underground chapels, the most famous being St. Kinga's Chapel, carved entirely out of salt in the later centuries. But even in the 14th and 15th centuries, smaller worship chambers were constructed deep underground not just as places of faith, but as air breaks. These wide, high-ceilinged spaces helped reduce humidity through vertical expansion, allow airflow to slow and redistribute, serve as rest points where air was marginally fresher due to better circulation. The walls of these chapels, while devotional, were also functional. Miners knew which ones breathed well. Some even scheduled shift changes to pass through these chambers, using prayer time as a chance to recover physically. Life in the mine. Workers in Wieliczka lived in shifts. Some stayed underground for several days, sleeping in carved niches or wooden bunk platforms. Meals were brought down. Waste was carried up or disposed of in abandoned shafts. The need for ventilation went beyond safety. It was about making life possible. Early on, horses and oxen were used to lift salt from deeper galleries. These animals, sensitive to bad air, were considered living gas detectors. When a horse began to stumble or refuse to descend, work halted. Later, as animal use declined, miners relied again on candle tests, breathing rhythms, and the sound of dripping water which changed subtly with pressure shifts, a skill learned only after years underground. A royal concern. Because Wieliczka was a royal enterprise, issues of ventilation and health eventually reached the monarchy. Polish kings, especially during the Jagiellonian dynasty, sent inspectors and foreign engineers to study the mine. By the late 1400s, air quality reports were written for royal review. One such document describes: the tunnels long, the breath of men much taxed. The lanterns are dim at depth, and the smell of bad water is great. Air must be moved. A German engineer was hired in 1493 to advise on improvements. He recommended countershaft air funnels, using water-powered lifts to double as bellows, rotating wind wheels, turned by surface windmills to draw air upward, fan tunnels, carved at specific angles to encourage convection. These plans were only partially realized, but they represent one of the earliest known efforts to integrate surface energy with underground airflow. As you sit in the quiet of an old gallery, surrounded by salt walls that shimmer faintly in your torchlight, the air is still, too still. And you ask yourself, if salt preserves the body, can it preserve a breath long after the lungs that drew it are gone? You've descended further now, past chapels and shafts, past walls that glisten with mineral frost and carvings of saints whose eyes have watched generations of miners pass in silence. The air has changed. It moves in slow, uneven pulses, like a lung exhaling centuries of memory. This is the mid-depth region of the Wieliczka salt mine in the early 16th century. Here the salt is rich, the galleries are vast, and the most important resource, air, is not always present. In this section, we examine how Wieliczka transformed from a simple brine operation into one of Europe's most advanced subterranean environments, and how its engineers, priests, and miners worked together to understand and control air in a place where even breathing was a feat of design. A mine in constant motion. By 1500, Wieliczka was no longer just a mine. It was a city underground with over 200 chambers on multiple levels, miles of passageways carved by hand, multiple hoisting systems powered by treadmills, horses, and later water wheels, and a full-time population of miners, woodworkers, engineers, surveyors, salt measurers, and guards. It was a logistical marvel, and with this complexity came an unavoidable challenge: how to keep every part of the mine supplied with breathable air. The deeper sections of Wieliczka, beyond 200 meters, were particularly prone to thermal stagnation. Without consistent temperature shifts or external drafts, the air would go still. In some chambers, the flame of a lamp would hover quietly before dying, not flickering, but smothering itself in invisible damp. Air as infrastructure. To fix this, Wieliczka's planners began treating air not as an afterthought, but as a part of the mine's architecture. They developed a series of innovations, still primitive by modern standards, but remarkable for their time. One, ventilation shafts built with purpose. Instead of simple holes, new shafts were constructed with dual channels, one for intake, one for exhaust. Wooden partitions to separate flow and prevent mixing. Carefully calculated angles, encouraging natural convection. These shafts were connected to furnace chambers, where small fires were kept burning to create an upward draft. While this method had been used elsewhere, Wieliczka refined it. Stone chimneys were lined with salt-resistant clay. Fires were placed at the tops of shafts, not in tunnels, reducing risk. A rotating schedule ensured chambers didn't overheat or go unmonitored. 2. Pressure doors and directional flaps. Wooden air doors, fitted with leather hinges and canvas seals, were placed at regular intervals to guide airflow. Miners learned to calculate their opening and closing based on sound, feel, and candle behavior. These doors weren't just for air, they served as emergency controls, able to isolate chambers in case of gas buildup or collapse. Some chambers had double-door systems, allowing one to be opened without breaking the overall pressure structure. This was one of the earliest forms of an airlock in underground architecture. Measuring the unmeasurable. There were no barometers in Wieliczka at this time, no gas detectors, but the miners developed an intuitive system of measurement using what they had. Candle behavior. Candles were used to check for low oxygen, flames shrank or extinguished. Detect drafts, flicker direction. Judge humidity, how fast the flame burned down. Miners also used body awareness as an indicator. Tightness in the chest, right arrow, stale air. Sudden perspiration, trapped heat. Dry mouth or sore throat, right arrow, overventilation and salt dust. And then there were the salt blooms formations that grew in certain corners of chambers. These were closely watched. When the blooms changed shape or color, it signaled a shift in humidity and airflow. Some stewards kept salt journals, recording where and when these growths formed or changed. These records, though ignored by royalty, were studied closely by experienced miners. The breath of God. Wieliczka was not just a mine, it was also a place of faith. The underground chapels, some lit by oil lamps and carved from single blocks of salt, were not only used for prayer, but for sanctifying the mine's operation. Priests blessed shafts, Services were held before opening new galleries. In times of air crisis, when fumes sickened entire teams, mass was held for the recovery of breath. But there was more than ceremony here. The architecture of worship was deeply linked to ventilation. The largest chambers acted as air reservoirs, stabilizing pressure changes. The carved altars were placed at intersections of airflow, offering both symbolic and literal respite. Even the salt chandeliers' later innovations were designed to burn clean and long, helping engineers judge air quality by the stability of flame. Faith was part of the system, not as a substitute for engineering, but as a partner in survival. Fireless light. One of the most unique adaptations at Wieliczka was the push for fireless lighting in air-sensitive zones. In lower chambers where flame risk was high, miners used reflective salt mirrors, polished to direct light from safer galleries. Sun shafts, installed at angles to catch daylight for short periods. Early phosphorescent materials, smeared on walls though unreliable, they glowed faintly in humid air. These techniques reduced the need for open flames, and in doing so, reduced the oxygen burden of lamps in tight spaces. Collapsing caution. Despite these efforts, Wieliczka was not immune to failure. In 1528, a collapse in the upper galleries caused a blockage in one of the primary air shafts. With airflow reduced by over half, miners in the Friedrich chamber began to report symptoms of asphyxiation within hours. Nausea, panic, dizziness, sudden unconsciousness. 3 men died. Their bodies were found curled near a wooden duct, trying to catch the last movement of air. After this, Wieliczka engineers adopted a new policy. No chamber was to be expanded unless at least 2 ventilation points were established in advance. It was the first time in the mine's history that air was prioritized over salt. A breathing mine. By the end of the 16th century, Wieliczka had developed into a modular, ventilated, and responsive underground world. Its engineers had no formal training. They did not use equations, but they built systems of flow, structures of resilience, a mind that learned how to breathe. Now standing in a silent corridor carved 6 centuries ago, you run your hand along the salt-polished wall. The air is cool and still not dead, but waiting. And you realize, this is not just a mine. This is a machine for air, a cathedral not only of stone but of breath. You are standing in one of the deeper levels now, far beneath the surface. The walls are smooth and pale, glittering faintly under your lamp. The silence is absolute except for the faintest movement of air brushing against your ear. It's easy to imagine this space as tomb-like, sealed, and unchanging. But this mine is not dead. It still breathes. In this final section of the story of Wieliczka, we look at how air and architecture were preserved through changing eras, from medieval resilience to Renaissance precision and beyond. The salt did not only preserve meat and money, it preserved systems, habits, and lessons. This is a story not of decay, but of continuity, where underground winds outlived the kings who ordered them. From hand tools to formal planning. By the 17th century, the Wieliczka salt mine had become one of the most technically advanced mining complexes in Europe. The work that began with hammers and buckets now involved detailed mine maps with elevations and flow diagrams, specialized job roles, air stewards, pump engineers, brattice builders, and formal ventilation planning, where airflow was considered in the initial design of every new chamber. What had once been improvisation, cloth flaps, candle checks, superstitious warnings, was now systematized. The mine was designed to breathe. It had become, in essence, an engineered lung. And with each passing century, this system was not abandoned, it was improved. The salt keeps the story. One of Wieliczka's oddities is that it didn't collapse, rot, or vanish the way many mines did. That's because salt is both destroyer and preserver. Salt erodes wood and corrodes iron. But it also kills bacteria, dries moisture, and inhibits decay. As a result, parts of the mine remain almost perfectly preserved, including wooden air ducts from the 1500s, crank-driven ventilation shafts, sealed flaps made from ox hide, still intact, salt inscriptions warning miners of faint wind or stale chamber. These are not replicas. They are original, left behind in the quiet zones, unreachable to tourists, untouched by light or breath for centuries. Some of the earliest air design systems in Europe still sit beneath Poland, unchanged, fossilized in sodium and shadow. Fire finally controlled. Unlike coal or metal mines, Wieliczka's great danger was not methane, but still, the risk of fire remained, especially in the timber structures, surface smelting areas, and hoisting systems powered by horse gins or water. Eventually, the mine developed an internal fire brigade, one of the first in any European mining operation. But they were also responsible for air, checking the balance of draft near fire chambers, ensuring furnace ventilators were not overheating shafts, monitoring the temperature rise in sealed tunnels where brine could produce slow chemical reactions. It was a reminder that even in a salt mine, fire was never entirely gone, it only waited. Enlightenment and the science of air. By the 18th century, scientific instruments began replacing instinct. Polish engineers, working with German and Austrian consultants, introduced thermometers to measure heat buildup, barometers for pressure tracking, anemometers, crude but effective, to measure airflow speed. They also began experimenting with mine ventilation models above ground, building small tunnels to test air patterns using smoke and weighted flaps. Some of these engineers went on to influence mining laws across Austrian Galicia and even into parts of Germany and Hungary. One engineer, Joseph Pusch, published extensive treatises on salt mine ventilation in the early 19th century, drawing directly from Wieliczka's operations. His work would later be cited in early industrial mining guides as a foundation for modern air management. And yet, none of this would have been possible without the centuries of quiet innovation that came before by miners who had no names, no books, and no tools beyond their senses. Rituals of air. Even as the science advanced, the rituals remained. Before each new shaft was opened, priests still offered blessings not just for safety, but for air. St. Kinga, the patroness of salt miners, remained the guiding spirit of Wieliczka, with her chapel positioned strategically at a central junction where air from multiple galleries met. Candles continued to be used, not only for light, but as symbols of measured flame, their steadiness or struggle still guiding decisions. Even the mine's festival days, held underground in massive carved chambers, featured processions that moved through key air paths, perhaps unconsciously testing the health of the mine as they sang. A breath that never left. Today, parts of Wieliczka are open to tourists. Some chambers are museums, others are silent, but some areas are still active, maintained for research, preservation, or simply to keep the air moving. The mine still breathes, quietly, constantly. Air circulates through ancient ducts. Some paths are powered now by fans. Others still operate with natural convection, using the same shafts and chambers mapped out 400 years ago. Sensors monitor it all, but the principles remain. Warm air rises. Cold air falls. Flow matters more than pressure. And breath is everything. The Salt Cathedral of Air. To walk through Wieliczka today is to walk through a history of ventilation itself. From crude flaps to rotating ventilators. From instinct to architecture. From sacred spaces to sealed shafts. Every part of the mine reflects an ancient understanding. A mine without air is not a mine, it is a grave. now standing in the deepest, darkest part of Wieliczka, where the walls glisten with crystals and time, you pause your breath. You listen. You feel it. A faint draft older than memory slips past your shoulder. And you wonder, if we built entire empires on salt and kept them alive only through air, what happens when the salt holds on, but the breath disappears? Story 6. Mercury Madness in Almadane, the Curse of Liquid Silver. The sun scorches the plains of La Mancha, southern Spain, where the land cracks under dry heat. But below, in the town of Almadane, it is not fire that threatens, it is liquid silver, the shimmering, slithering metal called mercury, or as the Romans knew it, hydrargyrum. It's the 16th century, and Spain is becoming rich beyond imagining. Gold and silver flood in from the New World. But it is here, underground in Almadane, that one of the most critical materials in Spain's imperial machinery is extracted, not for coinage, but to extract coinage. Mercury is used in the amalgamation process, a chemical method that separates silver from ore. Without mercury, silver from the Americas cannot be refined. Without Almadane, there is no mercury. But the cost of this shimmering lifeblood is extraordinary. Not in gold, not in time. In lungs, in sanity, in air. A mine older than empire. Almadane was not new in the 1500s. The mine had been in operation since Roman times, when prisoners and slaves were forced to extract cinnabar, a vivid red ore rich in mercury sulfide. The Romans used mercury in cosmetics, medicine, and alchemy, but they also recognized its dangerous fumes. Centuries later, the Spanish crown took direct control of Almadane, making it a royal property, guarded, fortified, and worked to the edge of collapse. It became one of Europe's few large-scale sources of mercury, a material more valuable than silver by weight because it released silver from its prison. The descent into vapors. The mine at Almadane was vast, layered with chambers, extraction pits, and smelting zones. The cinnabar ore was removed by pickaxe, carted by hand, and then heated in retorts and furnaces to separate the mercury. This process released toxic mercury vapor, heavy and invisible, which sank into every crevice of the mine. There were no ventilation systems, no masks, no warnings. The only clue was the sweet metallic smell and the sudden onset of symptoms. Headaches, tremors, madness, death. The miners called it La Danza del Metal, the dance of the metal, because the hands of poisoned workers would twitch and shake as if dancing before death. The prisoners who breathed death. By the mid-1500s, working at Almadane was so dangerous that free men refused to labor in the mine. The Spanish crown responded by sending prisoners not only from Spain, but from across its territories. Criminals, political dissidents, slaves from North Africa. They were chained and lowered into the pits. Many died within months, some within weeks. It was said that the mine consumed men faster than it produced metal. Still, the demand for mercury grew, as the patio process, a silver refining method developed in Mexico, became standard. Each ounce of New World silver required drops of Almadane's poison. Breathing the invisible. The core problem was not visible, it was air. Mercury vapor is heavier than oxygen. It clings to the floor, filling lower tunnels and chambers first. Men working the deeper galleries would breathe in lethal doses before even feeling short of breath. There were no candles to flicker in warning. Mercury doesn't explode. It doesn't smell strong. It doesn't color the air. It simply replaces breath with madness. Miners grew pale and quiet, their speech slurred. Some began hallucinating. Others forgot their own names. It wasn't until the 18th century that modern science began to connect these symptoms to mercury poisoning, but the miners of Almadane already knew. The deeper the vein, the less of you returns. The fire without wind. In most mines, airflow was aided by natural draft, warm air rising, cool air sinking. But Almadene's heat was not from the earth, it was from furnaces, burning constantly to process cinnabar. This created a reverse draft, trapping vapor and forcing it downward. Ventilation was almost impossible. Miners improvised, crawling to higher tunnels to breathe, wetting cloths to tie around mouths, though mercury passed through, sending animals ahead to see if they survived. Nothing worked for long. Even those not directly exposed began showing signs of poisoning over time from residual vapor, dust on skin, or contact with mercury-contaminated tools. The mine itself became a closed system of decay. Alchemy, profit, and denial. Outside the mine, mercury was associated with alchemy and transformation. Physicians used it in remedies. Nobles sought it for mystical experiments. No one questioned its use. The profits were too great. The crown knew the risks but found the death of criminals acceptable. The mine was operated like a death mill: produce, die, replace. Records from the Council of the Indies list shipments of mercury by the ton destined for Potosi, Zacatecas, and other silver cities in the Americas. For every shipment, an estimated 30-50 lives were lost at Almadene. And still the crown demanded more. A world built on poisoned breath. By 1600, Almadene was not only the largest mercury mine in the world, it was the most important invisible engine of Spain's colonial wealth. Its poison made silver extraction efficient. That silver funded armies, navies, cathedrals, and kings. But in the tunnels, the air stayed still. It shimmered faintly in torchlight, and those who breathed it could feel their thoughts unraveling. They spoke to shadows. They trembled in sleep. Some clawed at their own faces. There were no engineers assigned to solve this problem. Only scribes to record the loss. You rest now at the edge of a chamber where the cinnabar dust still coats the walls. The air is quiet, still. You think of those who knelt to pick up molten mercury with ladles, who inhaled vapor until the world melted, and you ask, how many empires were built on air so toxic, even memory struggles to hold it? You step deeper into the earth, and the walls around you shift from dull gray to a deeper crimson. The cinnabar here is raw and heavy, streaking the stone like dried blood. You've entered the processing chambers of Almadene, where stone became wealth and men became ghosts. This is the 17th century, and the mine is no longer a regional asset. It is a strategic imperial necessity. The mercury drawn from these tunnels does not stay in Spain. It sails across oceans to New Spain, Peru, and Bolivia, where it becomes the linchpin of silver extraction. Without it, the colonial economy collapses. But there is a trade-off. Every drop of mercury sent abroad is paid for in lungs, minds, and years of human life. This is not a story of kings or conquests. It's a story of invisible poison, trapped air, and how entire systems of wealth were built on the slow and silent death of miners no one intended to save. A machine of men and metal. By the mid-1600s, Almadene was operated with ruthless efficiency. Prison labor made up most of the workforce. 24-hour cycles kept extraction continuous. A complex network of shafts, retorts, and furnaces ran day and night. And still the air did not move. The deeper one went, the more the vapors pooled. Mercury vapor, heavier than air, would settle in hollows and crevices, waiting for the next breath to draw it in. There were no fans, no engineered airflow systems. The only ventilation came from gravity and death as men died in lower galleries. Others avoided the area long enough for some of the vapor to dissipate. It was not air movement. It was rotational survival. The anatomy of poison. The mercury extracted here came in two forms. Elemental mercury, a silvery liquid, beautiful but deceptive. Vaporized mercury, odorless, invisible, and far deadlier. In the roasting process, cinnabar ore was heated in enclosed stone ovens, where the mercury boiled off as a vapor. It was then passed through cooled stone flues, condensing into liquid form and collected in troughs. But the seals were crude, the doors leaked. The cooling chambers often vented directly into the underground air. Miners, chained or not, stood within meters of active vapor discharge. Symptoms were predictable: shaking hands that worsened with time, slurred speech known as the silver tongue, drooling and memory loss, visual and auditory hallucinations, sudden fits of rage or weeping. Supervisors often described it as madness, but kept records noting that the condition often improves upon return to surface air. This was rarely true. The damage was cumulative and permanent. The living dead of Almadane. By the time a prisoner had worked 6 months in Almadane, he could expect muscle tremors, shortened breath, a yellow-gray pallor to the skin, chronic fatigue and confusion. Those with the worst symptoms were often sent to rest in higher galleries, supposedly for recovery. In truth, they were left to die more slowly, away from the fresher recruits. Some of these men wandered away from their shifts, hiding in the tunnels. Others collapsed mid-task. A few attacked fellow prisoners or guards not out of malice, but in neurological confusion. An Almadane overseer in 1664 wrote, "They do not return as they entered. The metal alters them. They fear the sun and they forget their names." No one left to work. In some years, the death rate was so high that the Crown could not fill the mine with convicts alone. By mid-century, authorities began using indentured labor from debtors, African slaves, captured and sold through Portuguese merchants, forced conscription of poor farmers during times of economic hardship. It was known, quietly, that to be sent to Almadane was a delayed death sentence. Rumors of ghost miners spread. Men who had forgotten who they were, digging endlessly in the lower chambers, unaware they were free to go. Despite this, the mine produced over 6,000 flasks of mercury per year, much of which was shipped to Potosi, the Bolivian mountain that was both a silver mine and a graveyard in its own right. The poisoned breath of Almadane became the extraction breath of the Americas. The first signs of change. Though ignored for centuries, some engineers and scholars began taking notice. One such man was Juan Alonso de Bustamante, a mining administrator who in 1678 submitted a report describing concerning air of thick property, men who lose sense without fever, vapors that stick to floors and walls. He recommended that all roasting furnaces be moved to the surface and vented with chimneys rising above the mine mouth. This was a radical suggestion. It would reduce production speed but save lives. It was rejected. Instead, a compromise was enacted. Some smaller furnaces were shifted upward, and new surface ventilation towers were tested, but without altering the mine's core structure. Production remained king. The vapor beyond Almadane. It's easy to think of mercury as a local problem, but the air that poisoned Almadane did not stay in Spain. Shipments of mercury were loaded into sealed flasks, goatskin-lined clay bottles weighing over 75 pounds each. On warm days, they leaked. Ships carrying mercury often reported crew illness, and some were refused at port due to the silver sickness. In Mexico and Peru, miners who used mercury for silver refining developed similar symptoms to those in Almadane despite never entering the mine. Mercury was now global poison, carried on sails, soaked into timbers, absorbed through skin. It entered rivers, air, flesh. The very material that made colonial silver extraction possible also dismantled the bodies of those who touched it. Resistance and survival. Despite the horror, Workers at Almadane developed strategies to survive, however limited. Tunnels were occasionally opened at both ends, allowing faint drafts. Workers shared poison masks, bundles of herbs wrapped in cloth, pressed over mouth and nose, mostly symbolic but better than nothing. Some men chewed bitter leaves, believing it kept the spirit strong against the fumes. And some refused entirely. There are records of prisoners who accepted execution rather than return to Almadane. One wrote in his confession, "Let me be judged in God's air, not in the breath of hell." In the silence of a cooling furnace chamber, where the last trickles of mercury glisten on the stone floor, you can still feel it. The warmth, the weight, the air that doesn't move. And you ask, if poison makes a nation rich, who counts the breaths that paid for its coins? You are in one of the oldest galleries now. The floor beneath your feet is warped from centuries of heat and condensation. The walls sweat with mineral memory. Above you, a faint echo rings down from the surface vents, modern, mechanical, but distant. This is Almadane in its twilight, the 18th and 19th centuries, a place still producing mercury but slowly reckoning with what it had built, a global machine powered by poisoned air. As empires shifted and the Enlightenment dawned, the mind changed. Slightly. But even with reforms, even with new knowledge, the breath of Almadane remained laced with death. And the world above, still counting silver and gold, was in no hurry to exhale the truth. A slow turn toward reform. By the early 1700s, Enlightenment thinkers and mining engineers across Europe began paying attention to worker health, not out of compassion but out of productivity concerns. Dead men do not mine. In Almadane, reforms were proposed. Surface roasting of cinnabar ore to reduce underground vapor. Forced ventilation systems using bellows and chimney towers. Better protective gear, including leather masks and oiled cloths. Limiting prisoner labor to shorter shifts in the most toxic galleries. Some of these changes were implemented, especially after an explosion in 1755 revealed the volatile mix of mercury vapor and enclosed heat underground. However, systemic change was slow. Much of the mine's infrastructure still relied on designs from the previous century, and the deeper chambers remained lethal. For many miners, the only real improvement was the promise of slightly longer life. The world runs on quicksilver. Even as reforms were debated, Almadane's mercury output reached new heights. This was due in part to the rise of industrial silver extraction in South America, the use of mercury in scientific instruments, medicines, and military detonators, its role in mirror making, which became a fashion across royal Europe. Almadane supplied over 2/3 of the world's mercury. Its flasks bore the royal stamp and were counted more carefully than the men who filled them. In 1777, a royal directive required every flask be tracked by volume, but no record was required for the men who loaded them unless they died. Then a note was made. Expired due to vapors. Lost from trembling. Returned from duty, unfit. They were not names, only losses. A royal hospital for the poisoned. One of the more revealing developments came in 1792, when the Spanish crown opened the Royal Hospital of San Rafael, near Almadane, exclusively for miners. It was a strange admission, a facility to treat people harmed by the very industry that employed them. The hospital specialized in treating tremors and seizures, pulmonary collapse, neurological disorders now recognized as mercury poisoning. But treatments were limited. Mercury leaves no easy trace. The damage is invisible and permanent. The hospital mostly served as a place for men to fade away more quietly. It became known locally as La Casa del Humo, the House of the Vapor. The end of forced labor. In 1801, Spain officially abolished the use of chained convict labor in Almadén. It was a symbolic gesture by this time. Most prisoners died or fled before completing their sentences. The new workforce was paid labor, but poorly. Often peasants or the sons of previous miners, they worked for meager wages and were expected to toughen up against the vapors. But something else was changing: air itself. Modernization brought better airflow. Primitive ductwork, aided by wind catchers and eventually mechanical fans, began to circulate the deeper galleries. The roasting furnaces were moved fully to the surface, enclosed in towers with upward draft chimneys. For the first time in centuries, the air underground began to move. Still toxic, but now diluted. Echoes in the Americas. Even as Almadén modernized, the damage was global. In Peru and Bolivia, miners continued to die from mercury used in the patio process. Children working with bare hands to mix mercury into crushed ore fell ill within years. In California, during the gold rush, Almadén's mercury was used in thousands of sluice boxes, spreading contamination across rivers, wetlands, and fisheries that remain tainted to this day. By the 19th century, mercury was in the soil of half a continent, the breath of two hemispheres, the bloodstream of uncounted thousands. And yet few understood it. It was just the silver helper, the red stone that gave up its gleaming prize. Almadén's strange immortality. Production at Almadén continued into the 20th century. Through wars, regimes, and revolutions, the mine never stopped. It survived. The Napoleonic invasions. The Spanish Civil War. Global mercury bans in the late 1900s. Only in 2000 did Almadén finally cease production after over 2,000 years of continuous mining, one of the longest industrial legacies in human history. Today, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, with museums, preserved galleries, and warnings posted in multiple languages. Do not touch the walls, do not lick your hands. The ghost in the tunnel. As you stand now in the stillness of a preserved furnace chamber, where once the cinnabar roared with heat, the mercury flowed like silver blood and men breathed in death, you listen. The air is clean now, but something lingers, a faint sweetness, a memory in the breath of stone. Almadén no longer kills, but it remembers. And the world above still glitters with treasures extracted by those who breathed their worth into coin, mirror, and crown. So you wonder, if every breath we take carries a trace of the past, how many of ours still carry Almadén's curse? Story 7. The tunnelers of 30 ice altitude and air in the Swiss Alps. The wind howls constantly at 3,000 meters above sea level. The ice hardens into polished glass over the surface of the mountain. You are in the Glarus Alps, where Switzerland's great peaks rise like jagged monuments, and where one of the strangest and least known engineering feats of early modern Europe took place not for war, not for riches, but for survival. Welcome to Mount Turdy, late 18th century. The villagers below, farmers, herders, and monks, face a growing problem. Their seasonal water source, fed by glacial melt, has begun to dry earlier each year. The traditional spring melt now disappears too quickly, the river running dry by late summer. The cause? A series of glacial shifts, increased farming demand, and unseasonably warm years, what we might now recognize as a local climate fluctuation. But they didn't have that term. They only knew the pastures were yellowing, the cows were thin, and the livelihood of the valley was dying. So they decided to digging into ice and air. It began in 1792 with a proposal from the monks of the Dissentese Abbey, whose monastic records included centuries of water levels and harvest cycles. They petitioned the local landowners and cantonal authorities to approve a bold idea: dig a tunnel beneath the glacier to redirect meltwater to the other side of the Turdy Massif. This would require a team of trained and untrained workers. Months at high altitude, tunneling through rock, permafrost, and glacial ice. And most importantly, staying alive without suffocating. This is not a story of grand machinery. There were no steam engines here, no state funding, just wooden drills, pickaxes, and a system of hand-powered bellows to keep the men from dying in the mountain's frozen gut. The oxygen question. Digging at high altitude is different from mining at sea level. The tunnelers at Turdy weren't just carving into rock, they were doing so in an oxygen-poor environment, with less atmospheric pressure, lower temperatures, and air that barely moved once underground. At 3,000 meters, even standing still can leave a person lightheaded. Now imagine swinging a pickaxe, lighting a fire for warmth, sharing the tunnel with livestock used to haul spoil, and breathing the same stale air as 10 other men in a confined space. The primary survival question became, how do you breathe at altitude in a tunnel with no natural draft? Bellows, tubes, and fires. The initial method was simple: manual bellows placed at the tunnel entrance. These were operated in shifts by young boys or injured laborers, forcing air down a canvas and goatskin tube made from old wine sacks sewn together. But the tunnel grew deeper, and the effort to push air further into the narrowing rock passage became nearly impossible. So they innovated. They placed mirrors at the tunnel's mouth, angling sunlight down into the tunnel, not for light but to create heat differentials. This warmed the entrance enough to produce a weak convection current, pulling cold air into the back of the tunnel and pushing stale air out. This wasn't science as we know it. It was instinct, faith, and observation, but it worked, marginally. Tools frozen to hands. One of the biggest risks wasn't suffocation but frostbite. Inside the glacier tunnel, ice formed instantly on metal tools. If a miner's glove was torn or removed, skin could stick and rip on the frozen shaft of an iron pick. Even breath became a hazard. In one journal entry by a monk overseeing the work, he writes, "We have lost 3 fingers today not to rockfall, but to the bitter breath of our own bodies, frozen upon touch." They developed routines. Wrapping tools with wool. Lighting oil lamps not for visibility, but to keep fingers flexible. Working in short, 15-minute rotations to avoid hypothermia and air loss. This led to an unusual rhythm, a breathing tunnel, with men moving in and out like lungs inhaling and exhaling in the snow. The tunnel lives. By late 1793, they had dug nearly 180 meters into the glacier's edge. Water was beginning to appear first as drips, then as steady streams. The tunneling had found a vein of meltwater, a seasonal flow that could now be redirected. But with that water came danger. Melting increased the risk of collapse, and the warm air pulled in to support the workers now began to erode the ice ceiling, creating dripping chambers that resembled cathedrals of frost haunting, majestic, and unstable. Still they worked, not for profit, not for glory, but to save a valley's future. Breathing together. Perhaps the strangest feature of the Turdy project was how collective it was, not just in manpower, but in respiration. When the tunnel team was working, no one lit fires in nearby shelters. The community saved oxygen-rich wood and waited for signal smoke puffs from a lookout to begin boiling water or cooking. The valley breathed with the tunnel. Breath was rationed, movement timed. It was one of the rare historical moments where an entire rural society adapted its rhythms to the respiratory limits of an engineering project. No one in the village understood oxygen, but they understood life and its limits. Now you sit by the original entrance to the Turdy Tunnel, where the old canvas tubing still lies in coils, long deflated. A cold wind comes down from the heights. You can see your breath. And you wonder, when survival required controlling even the air between us, How did they learn to breathe in silence together? It is now spring, 1794. The snow is melting early again. The meadows in the Linth Valley show hints of green, but the water is not staying. It rushes past in torrents and disappears within weeks, soaking into cracked riverbeds and vanishing downstream. Once again, the high pasture herders worry. Will there be enough to last the summer? But something has changed this year. For the first time, a controlled stream of glacial meltwater is emerging not from the mountain's traditional runoff, but from a hand-dug tunnel beneath the Turdy Glacier itself. It is only a trickle, but it is a human-made trickle, pulled by ingenuity from beneath hundreds of meters of rock and ice. And though the air inside the glacier is still thin, still dangerously still, the tunnel is now alive, not just with men but with movement, with strategy, with an evolving understanding of how to survive where air should not go. Deepening the tunnel, shrinking the air. After the initial breakthrough into meltwater veins, the monks and their team did not stop. The goal was now to extend the tunnel further under the glacier, tapping deeper and more consistent flows. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous the air became. The canvas tubing system, hand-pumped from outside, had reached its physical limit. Air no longer traveled far enough to reach the inner chambers. Workers began to suffer from dizziness and nausea after less than 10 minutes inside. A sense of airlessness, even when standing still. Frequent nosebleeds and blurred vision. They experimented again. Some tried pulling in cold surface air by draping long tubes down the icy slope and using gravity-fed cold drafts. Others suggested burning small fires at the tunnel mouth to pull air through by convection, but this risked collapse from melting. Eventually, they discovered that silent, cold air moved best when left alone. They minimized light. They staggered work teams, creating space between groups so that each brought in fresh oxygen rather than sharing the stale breath of those ahead. Frostbite, fog, and faith. Winter returned with renewed violence. The peaks above Turdy trapped clouds for weeks, creating a condition the workers called blue fog, a pale, heavy mist that descended from the glacier and settled over the village like breath exhaled by the mountain. Many believed the glacier was breathing back, rejecting their intrusion. But the work continued, inside the tunnel. Wooden struts were installed to keep the ice from slowly squeezing the passage shut. Straw and moss were packed into small alcoves as makeshift insulators. Fires were banned entirely inside. Oxygen was too valuable, and accidents from smoke inhalation had already claimed 2 men. The only warmth came from the bodies of the workers themselves. And their breath, which hung in the air like ghost vapor, was the only sign that the mountain was being carved by human hands. Engineering without the word. These were not trained engineers. There were no architects of ice. The monks kept records carefully, but most of the labor was improvised by local shepherds, former soldiers, farmhands, and even teenage boys who volunteered. What they created without plans was a thermodynamic marvel. A tunnel stable at sub-zero temperatures. Passive airflow based on seasonal temperature gradients. An outlet placed precisely at an elevation that allowed gravity-fed irrigation to lowland fields. They didn't understand fluid dynamics or altitudinal air pressure, but they understood how to listen to the ice, how to smell stale air, and how to mark spots where their breath no longer rose. One worker marked the tunnel wall with a scratched line and wrote, "Here the breath lies down." They avoided going beyond that mark on long shifts. The breathers and the listeners. There emerged 2 classes of workers. The breathers, those who worked the interior, swinging picks, pushing sleds, and dealing with the direct effects of altitude and confinement. The listeners, men who sat at the outer entrance, keeping track of time, sounds, and especially breathing rhythms. If the bellows worker heard irregular coughs or silence from the tunnel, he would signal with a hammer on the stone. If no reply came, a rope was pulled, and the line of men was evacuated. In this way, they created a primitive air monitoring system, based entirely on the pattern of human breath and the faint echoes of movement. They didn't have meters. They had ears, lungs, and trust. Breach. In the spring of 1795, the tunnel hit a pressurized chamber of glacial meltwater and fractured open. Water surged into the tunnel, forcing workers to scramble for their lives. But the breach, though dangerous, was a success. It provided a reliable, year-round flow of meltwater enough to irrigate the meadows below, fill livestock troughs, and sustain a valley that had come dangerously close to collapse. The project had lasted 3 years, involved over 50 men, and required working conditions as harsh as any deep mine. But they had done it. And they had breathed through it not with technology, but with observation, discipline, and an unspoken understanding of the mountain's invisible winds. Writing it into memory, the monks of Disentis documented the entire project not in technical terms, but in terms of weather, health, and the air's behavior. Their logs described days when the breath would not rise, moments when air felt thin and unwilling, times when the men spoke in wheezes as if under snow. From these records, later generations would build upon the same techniques. In the early 19th century, the Turdi Tunnel inspired similar alpine irrigation and ventilation projects in Valle, Ticino, and even as far as the Italian Dolomites. The breath of this glacier had been tamed, if only partially. Now, sitting by the ice-slicked interior of the restored tunnel, preserved as a national monument, you close your eyes and imagine the sound of bellows pumping, the slap of boots on frozen rock, the ragged cough of a man too far inside. You breathe deeply, and you wonder, when knowledge comes not from books but from lungs and silence, how many of history's greatest engineers never learned to read. The tunnel still exists, carved not for conquest nor for commerce, but to change the course of a stream and in doing so, the course of a valley's fate. Now a heritage site tucked beneath a slab of alpine ice, the Turdi Tunnel is still occasionally inspected, still cold, still alive in memory. But back in 1796, it was not a monument, it was a last resort. The tunnelers, many now ill, others permanently changed by the long exposure to low oxygen, cold, and overwork, had completed their task. The water was flowing, the fields were greening, and the valley below had entered a short golden period of renewed fertility and economic recovery. Yet the real legacy of the Turdi Tunnel wasn't in the water. It was in the air, and how humans had quietly, methodically learned to work with it, ration it, control it, and build within it at the very edge of survival. When the air remembers. Once the water had stabilized and the valley's economy improved, the tunnel was no longer worked continuously. It was maintained, but only seasonally. The men who had worked it were asked to return for inspections and small repairs, but many declined. Some, like Fridolin Neff, a tunneler who had written letters describing the sour air that made his teeth ache and hair fall out, refused to go near it again. Others reported dreams of breathing without breath or of falling endlessly into silent ice. One monk wrote, "The air under Turdi is not wind but memory. It does not forget who has passed through it." Whether these were signs of trauma, high-altitude exposure, or mercury-like symptoms from mineral gases remains unknown. But the emotional association between air and danger, between breath and risk, stuck. In local lore, the tunnel came to be known as Der Uitgang, the breath path. Scientific eyes. In 1832, a group of early alpine geologists visited the Turdi Tunnel as part of a broader survey of mountain hydrology. They were fascinated not only by the tunnel's survival, but by the descriptive notes left by the original builders. They discovered evidence of early passive air circulation systems, mimicking what would later be formalized in mining ventilation. Primitive understanding of altitude-induced hypoxia, decades before formal studies on it. Signs of thermally driven airflow, created through nothing but mirrored sunlight and spatial timing. In their journals, they called it an accidental laboratory of atmospheric science. And yet the villagers who had built it never saw it that way. To them, it was merely the difference between drought and pasture, life and loss. A disappearing tunnel. Over time, parts of the tunnel collapsed. The wooden supports rotted. Rockslides buried access points. One section was flooded by a sudden warming in 1867 during a summer heat wave. In 1902, the local council declared the tunnel of historical interest, and a project began to partially excavate and reinforce the original passage. But by then, the story had already passed into something more powerful than engineering. It had become a parable. Told to children by firelight, the story of the breath path taught that mountains don't yield easily. Air is not free when carved from ice. And that sometimes the most heroic labor is silent, slow, and unseen. Lessons in every breath. Today, the Turdy Tunnel is visited mostly by hikers, school groups, and a few historians who understand its deeper value. There are no statues for the tunnelers, no names carved into alpine plaques. Their breath shared, shallow, and disciplined is the only real monument. But the techniques they developed echo still in modern tunnel ventilation design, especially at altitude, emergency breathing protocols in avalanche survival, and even in space exploration, where controlled, rationed air must be moved through confined, frozen systems with no margin for error. The tunnel under Turdy was not a technical marvel by modern standards, but it was a human one and in many ways, still unsurpassed in its conditions and intent. Where the wind never blew. You stand now at the back of the reconstructed portion of the tunnel. The light from outside fades behind you. You can still feel the cold curl of mountain air sliding in faint, cautious. It does not roar, it does not rush. It whispers. And in that whisper is the memory of breath carefully saved, men waiting in line for air, and a whole village changing the way it lived just so a tunnel might live long enough to deliver spring. You take one more breath. It tastes of stone, moss, and old snow. And you wonder, if breath is life and air, survival, how many forgotten hands carved their legacy not in stone, but in the space between breaths. Story 8. The candle makers of Chartres smoke, airflow, and the cathedral's breath. It is a late afternoon in the 13th century, and the blue light pouring through the rose window of Chartres Cathedral casts a strange haze over the nave. The stone floor is cool. The vaulted ceiling, impossibly high, seems to breathe with every wind that passes outside. And below, in the shadowed corners of the transept, are candles. Hundreds of them, thick, dripping columns of beeswax and tallow, burning in iron stands and swinging candelabras. They flicker faintly, and their smoke coils upward like prayers with nowhere to go. What you're smelling is not sanctity. It's the result of early medieval air engineering, or rather, the lack of it. This is the story of the candle makers of Chartres, not the architects, not the masons, but the overlooked men and women who crafted the wax that kept the cathedral alive through darkness, and in doing so, learned how to manage smoke, breath, and flame in a building so tall, it could choke itself. The wax beneath the glory. By the time Chartres was largely completed in the 1220s, it was considered a marvel of its age. Its soaring vaults, radiant stained glass, and stonework had drawn pilgrims from across Europe. But as impressive as the structure was, the interior atmosphere of the cathedral was far from heavenly. The church required constant illumination, not just for ceremonies but for daily rituals, copying manuscripts, reading scripture and performing liturgies that could last long into the night. There were no electric lights. There were candles, thousands of them, burning simultaneously on feast days and vigils. A single candle emits roughly 0.1 grams of smoke per hour. Small amounts of carbon dioxide and particulate soot. Heat enough, when multiplied by the hundreds, to subtly raise the ambient temperature of a massive stone hall. Multiply this by 500 candles on an average day, and you begin to see the problem. The cathedral was not just a sacred space. It was a sealed, smoke-filled chamber, where the very breath of holiness came thick with beeswax and soot. Chartres Candle Guild. The city of Chartres had a small but specialized candle-making guild by the late 12th century. These artisans were responsible not only for producing wax, but also for understanding how it burned, how to mold it to suit the ever-changing needs of the cathedral's liturgy. There were 3 major types of candle used. Beeswax tapers reserved for high altars and important relics. Tallow candles made from animal fat, cheaper and far smokier, used in less public spaces. Oil lamps occasionally used in corners, though more dangerous due to spill risk. Beeswax was preferable, it burned cleaner and brighter, but it was expensive and required domestic apiaries to supply the vast quantities needed. It's estimated that on major feast days, Chartres consumed over 50 pounds of wax in a single 24-hour period. To keep up with demand, the Candle Guild became adept not only at production, but at managing burn rates, flame size, and the movement of air. They had to, because the cathedral couldn't breathe on its own. A building without lungs. Gothic cathedrals are often described as light-filled or airy, but structurally, Chartres was nearly airtight at the lower levels. The stained glass windows could not be opened. The thick walls, several meters deep, had no vents. The only points of air exchange were the doors and the occasional clerestory gap, high above the floor. In cold seasons, when windows were covered or heat needed to be retained, the air stagnated. The result: soot clinging to the ribs of the vaulted ceiling. Candles flickering unevenly due to carbon buildup. Worshippers reporting headaches, dizziness, or sudden fainting. One chronicler wrote, "On the night of the feast of St. Mary, the holy space was thick with fumes, as though the devil himself had cloaked the altar in black breath." It wasn't a demon. It was the candles. The candle masters become air managers. By the mid-13th century, the candle makers had adopted a secondary role, managers of cathedral air. They developed strategies such as staggered lighting, so not all candles burned at once, placing lower smoke candles near the choir and chapels, hanging large candelabras from chains, which could be raised or lowered to reduce heat pockets and allow smoke to rise more efficiently, creating smoke paths, arranged lighting patterns to draw air upward toward clerestory windows or the oculus in the transept. None of this was officially recorded in architectural plans. It was passed down orally, from master to apprentice. They also began experimenting with tallow wax blends to reduce smoke while keeping costs manageable. Smoke and ritual. In some cases, the smoke was embraced. During funerals, the lingering haze was seen as symbolic of the soul's ascent. During Easter Vigil, the lighting of the Paschal candle in a darkened nave relied on the contrast between smoky air and flame to dramatize the resurrection. But the candle makers knew too much smoke could ruin the effect. It could obscure the altarpiece, choke the choir, and worst of all, dim the stained glass that was central to the cathedral's message. So they walked a line, smoke as symbol but not as suffocation. Now, as you walk slowly through the cold stones of Chartres, the old air seems long gone. The candles are electric now, the soot scrubbed from the vaulted ribs. But the breath remains the breath of centuries of wax, flame, and silent calculations by those who understood that a single flame, multiplied, could fill a sacred space with meaning or suffocation. And so you wonder, when the holiest spaces are built too tight to breathe, who quietly keeps the air alive? It's now the mid-14th century, and Chartres Cathedral has grown quieter. The initial frenzy of construction has ended. The grand theological debates have shifted elsewhere, but life continues inside these stone walls, not in sermons or processions, but in the daily ritual of maintenance, lighting, and preservation. Beneath the soaring vaults, a smaller, unnoticed world still works, the world of the chandlers. You can hear the faint hiss of a taper being snuffed, the muted scratch of soot being scraped from a ledge 20 meters above the choir, a pair of apprentices whispering while they rebraid candle wicks with wax-softened fingers. This is not divine work, but it is holy in practice, for without these hands, the light would fail, and the cathedral would sit in darkness and stale air. And it's in this period that the candle makers of Chartres transform once again from mere producers of wax to masters of atmosphere. Wicks wax in what the eye can't see. By this time, the cathedral had settled into a stable routine. Daily services, rotating feast days, and night vigils all required a strict management of illumination. The chandlers began conducting quiet experiments. Wick length was carefully calibrated to reduce smoking. Shorter wicks burned hotter, producing more light with less residue. Twisted triple braids were introduced in the wick core to help channel oxygen evenly. Candles were cooled faster or slower depending on where they would be placed. Those in higher places were hardened quickly to prevent sagging. Those near chapels were cooled more slowly to burn longer and more evenly. These were not scholarly investigations. There were no treatises, just generations of careful trial, apprenticeship, and sharp observation. The chandlers weren't simply lighting candles. They were adjusting the very texture of light and air in a building meant to symbolize eternity. Smoke as a clue. The candle makers developed an uncanny ability to read smoke. They could walk the nave and tell whether a wick was too long by the color of its smoke, whether tallow had been mixed into a wax taper by the sharpness of its scent, whether air was trapped in a vault by how long a cloud of smoke lingered in one spot. They began to draw smoke maps not with ink, but in memory, by watching how smoke drifted upward toward the oculus, how it pooled behind piers, how it was caught in the transverse arches. They built a mental model of the cathedral's breathing. In this way, they became the first real air engineers of the cathedral. Death by smoke. Despite these efforts, the air in Chartres was still dangerous. On more than one occasion, poorly managed vigils, especially during the long winter nights, led to minor suffocation events. One tragic example comes from a vigil held in 1349, during the height of the Black Death. The cathedral was filled with mourners. Hundreds of candles burned through the night in supplication. The doors were shut to prevent bad air from entering, ironically, trapping the worse air inside. Witnesses noted that several altar boys collapsed mid-service. One older monk died quietly while seated. The incident was attributed to illness, but the chandlers suspected something else. "The flame consumed all but God's breath," one wrote. "We lit our way to prayer and burned the air itself." After this event, chandlers pushed for subtle changes. Doors were opened for short intervals during large services. A chimney-like shaft, barely visible from the nave, was constructed to aid in drawing smoke upward. Night vigils were limited to smaller groups, and less crosswinds could be predicted. These changes were not theological. They were practical, invisible adjustments made by invisible hands, saving lives one airflow at a time. A sacred economy. The cathedral's candles weren't just for ritual, they were also currency. Donated candles bore the seal of the donor and were placed in specific locations to earn spiritual favor. Wax offered from wealthy patrons was often reused, melted down, and recast, blending the nobility's gifts with the poor's offerings. The cathedral maintained strict wax ledgers, recording pounds of wax consumed daily, ounces returned from stubs, and weight lost due to evaporation and spillage. The chandlers managed all of it. They weren't just candle makers. They were accountants of flame, controlling the cathedral's budget not in coin, but in drips of wax. And their records revealed more than economics. They showed seasonal air shifts, burn patterns, and even the slow soot blackening of stonework, which informed cleaning schedules and candle placement. When air becomes theology. As the chandlers refined their craft, the clergy began to borrow their language. Light as divine presence was already well established. But now, clean air began to symbolize purity of soul, while smoky air represented the obscuring of truth. During Lent, candles were burned at lower brightness, creating a more somber mood not just symbolically, but literally, by increasing smoke and dimming the nave. One priest even described salvation as a clearing of the breath, language clearly lifted from the chandler's world. The chandlers had shaped not only the cathedral's air, but its spiritual metaphor. Now you kneel where they once worked, behind a stone pillar near the ambulatory. It's quiet. No smoke curls from above, but for centuries this spot would have been shrouded in a haze of wax, tallow, and burnt linen wick. You close your eyes and imagine it. A man in a leather apron, hands slick with wax, watching the way a candle's smoke twists left instead of right. He nods, then moves 2 candles 6 feet apart, reshaping the cathedral's breath. You exhale, and you wonder how much of our sacred stillness is made possible by those who simply watched where the smoke went. By the time the 16th century arrived, the medieval world that built Chartres had faded into history. The cathedral still stood stately and solemn, but the world around it had shifted. The Reformation stirred across Europe, print had arrived, natural philosophy crept into the realm of theology, but inside Chartres the candles still burned. And somewhere behind the altars, in the quiet shadows where few ever looked, the chandlers still worked. A dimming tradition. By the early 1500s, new methods of lighting were beginning to appear in the wealthier churches: oil lamps with glass chimneys, carefully shielded torches, even sun mirrors that amplified daylight through clerestory windows. But Chartres, steeped in tradition and short of money, relied on its chandlers more than ever. And by this time, their methods had reached a kind of perfection. Wick braiding was a precise art, taught over 7 years of apprenticeship. The cathedral was mapped not by stone, but by air zones, places where smoke lingered, where flames danced too eagerly, where breath moved slowly or not at all. Chandlers were assigned specific naves or chapels, becoming experts in their unique microclimates. The result was an astonishing degree of atmospheric control in a building still without glass that opened, chimneys that drew properly, or any understanding of what we would now call ventilation science. One visiting architect from Rouen remarked, "The breath of Chartres is so finely tended that it seems not to stir, yet never chokes." And that was no accident. When fire went out of fashion, in the decades that followed, change accelerated. Glassmaking improved, allowing more natural light into buildings. Scientific inquiry revealed the dangers of indoor smoke in ways that theology could not. And in the wake of several cathedral fires, including the devastating blaze at Beauvais in 1573, the use of open flame was increasingly restricted. By the early 1600s, candle usage in Chartres was reduced by more than half. The chandlers, now fewer in number, were relegated to occasional ritual use, feast day preparations, and maintaining sacred relic lighting. Many of their once sacred responsibilities passed to sextons and secular caretakers. One elderly chandler, recorded only as Jean of the lower nave, wrote in a surviving margin note. I remember when flame ruled stone, and breath was guarded like the Eucharist. Now it is all air and no weight. His craft carried in whispers, memory and ritual was disappearing. The cathedral cleans its breath. In the 18th century, Chartres underwent its first major soot removal campaign. Centuries of candle smoke had left a grime on the ribs of the nave, on the sculptures near the triforium, and even on the famed stained glass. Restoration records show inches-thick soot deposits in high, inaccessible corners, blackened memories of centuries of flame. Modern workers, scrubbing with lye and cloth, encountered a mystery. The worst soot buildup wasn't where they expected above the main altar, but rather in the side chapels, areas that had been lit more modestly. This confused them. But had the Chandlers still been present, they might have explained. Those side chapels had poor air circulation, while the altar had been given every attention: custom-drafted candles, wide spacing, and managed flame heights to ensure air moved steadily upward. Even in their absence, the Chandlers' invisible touch had endured. Legacy in the air. Today, when you walk through Chartres Cathedral, you may not see them but the candle makers. Influence is everywhere. In the placement of altars, subtly informed by centuries of airflow knowledge. In the maintenance records, where wax weight and wick type still influence conservation choices. In the invisible memory of a building that once required careful breathing to stay alive. The Chandlers may be long gone, but every time you look up and see the vaulted ceiling free of smoke, you are witnessing the product of their labor. They made the air sacred not through incense or hymn, but by understanding its behavior when no one else thought to care. A final breath. You sit now at the edge of a transept, watching sunlight filter through stained glass that once blackened under candle smoke. The light is perfect, clean. There is no haze, no flicker of flame, just the silence of stone and colored light. But in your mind, you hear the soft hiss of a taper being lit, the sharp scent of beeswax, the invisible turbulence of heat drifting upward toward a Gothic vault. And you wonder, if a building can breathe, then who teaches it how? And when those who once taught it are forgotten, does it still remember to exhale?